In the early months of 1806, a small sailing vessel named Sydney Cove slipped out of Port Jackson, bound for the remote sealing grounds of the New Zealand coast. When she reached the wild waters near the southern cape, a boat was lowered and a party of men put ashore to begin their work among the seals. The landing soon turned into tragedy. Most of the group were killed and, according to later reports, eaten by local people. Only a young sailor named James Cadell survived. He saved himself by running to a chief called Tako and clinging to his cloak at the very moment when the leader was considered sacred and untouchable. Because of that belief, the boy's life was spared. Over the following years, Cadell married the chief's daughter, received the full facial tattoos of his adopted people, and slowly forgot the language of his birth. When he visited Sydney in the 1820s, he could barely speak English, and returned to New Zealand with a sense that it was now his true home. At that time, even basic geography remained uncertain, and the fact that the southern land was an island separate from the mainland had not yet been fully understood. Later in the same year, another episode unfolded far to the south. Captain Abraham Bristow, commanding the whaling ship Ocean, came upon an uncharted group of islands while pursuing whales. He named them the Auckland Islands, and on a second visit formally claimed them for the British Crown, releasing a few pigs on the shore as a symbolic beginning of settlement. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the rough maritime community of Sydney, and sealers began to treat the lonely islands as a seasonal base. The main island stretched some 30 miles, broken by narrow channels and bleak headlands, yet it promised profits to those willing to endure the storms. By this period, sealing had become one of the most lucrative trades in the Southern Ocean. Between 1810 and 1820, Sydney was crowded with hard-faced men whose fortunes depended on the skins of animals hunted to exhaustion. The memoirs of John Marmon, a sailor who grew up in those years, offer a vivid glimpse of their methods. As a boy, he sailed in the brig Commerce, which in 1807 carried a party of 30 people to the Auckland Islands, with orders to return loaded with skins. The voyage wandered across half the Pacific before finally reaching its destination in midsummer, when the islands appeared green and beautiful. Yet they were not empty. Rival gangs were already established and jealously guarded the best beaches. To gain a foothold, the captain resorted to deception. He went ashore claiming to be searching for a missing ship and invited the resident sealers aboard for drink. While they celebrated, their senses dulled by rum, the newcomers landed and secured their camp. The trick succeeded but left bitterness on both sides. After several uneasy weeks, the Commerce sailed on to the Chatham Islands and then to Mercury Bay, where the crew traded with local people for food and more skins. These exchanges were tense, for the coastal tribes had earned a reputation for violence, and only heavily armed parties were allowed ashore. Around the same time, another seaman working out of Sydney discovered that the land now called Stewart Island was separated from the South Island by a navigable strait. The man, whose name the island still bears, later returned to Scotland only to find that his wife had remarried, believing him dead. He drifted back to New Zealand, lived among the Māori, and ended his days in poverty. Yet his name remained fixed on the map. Relations between Europeans and the southern tribes were rarely peaceful. Disputes over women or stolen goods often ended in bloodshed, and the foreigners sometimes adopted the local custom of revenge by killing the next group they encountered. Gradually, however, both sides recognized the benefits of cooperation. One small island near Stewart Island was even granted to the sealers as a permanent settlement where they built huts and cultivated gardens with the help of Maori partners. The search for new hunting grounds pushed ever farther into the cold latitudes. In 1810, the brig Perseverance reached a rugged island later called Campbell Island. Huts and graves discovered there testified to earlier, forgotten parties. The following year, another remote speck of land, Macquarie Island, was found, and immediately swarmed by hunters. At first, the beaches were thick with animals, and a single voyage could return with tens of thousands of skins. Within a few seasons, the slaughter became so intense that the herds collapsed, and wild dogs left by the sealers finished the destruction by devouring pups and seabirds alike. Life for the men abandoned on these outposts was often desperate. On Solander Island, 5 sailors were rescued after more than 4 years of isolation. They had dressed in seal skins and lived almost entirely on seal meat, salting seabirds for the winter and eating a bitter fern root when nothing else could be found. With only an axe and a cooper's knife, they slowly built a crude boat, cutting 1 plank from each tree because they had no saw. Their rescue by the Perseverance seemed almost miraculous after so long without hope. Another tale of misery concerned the brig Betsy, which in 1815 carried a large crew to Macquarie Island. After landing part of the gang, the vessel became lost in storms, the rudder was torn away, and scurvy swept through the men. Water dwindled to a few mouthfuls a day, and deaths followed one after another. Finally, the survivors abandoned the ship in 2 small boats. The larger boat reached the New Zealand coast. The smaller, leaking badly, was cut adrift and disappeared. Those who landed were stripped by local people and for a time believed they would be killed. Months passed before a passing brig carried them back to civilization. Even when ships returned to collect their men, nature could prove more terrifying than human hostility. In 1816, a party rescued from Macquarie Island described weeks of violent earthquakes that shook the ground like waves and hurled rocks down the cliffs. The same year, American sailors discovered 3 wretched figures on the Snares Islands, abandoned years earlier when their captain had claimed there was not enough food for all hands. One of their companions had already died, and the rest survived only on potatoes they had planted, and whatever birds or seals they could catch. In late 1817, a sealing vessel named Sophia left Hobart for the stormy hunting grounds, south of New Zealand. Her master, James Kelly, dropped anchor in a sheltered inlet on the southeastern side of the far southern coast in mid-December. The first meetings on shore seemed calm. Local people approached without hostility, and their warmth was linked to a familiar face among the sailors, a man named William Tucker. On earlier visits, he had lived and traded along the coast, building a reputation good enough that many called out to him by a local name as if he belonged there. The next day, Kelly took a small boat with 6 men and rowed to a bay outside the harbour entrance, a short distance from the ship. Again, the reception looked friendly. Tucker was recognised immediately and greeted from several directions, and Kelly offered a small gift of iron to the local leader before stepping toward the chief's house to bargain for potatoes. One sailor stayed behind to watch the boat. Inside the settlement, Kelly encountered an unexpected figure, an Asian sailor who had been left behind by another vessel months earlier. The man spoke enough of the local language to make himself useful and offered to help secure food for the ship. While Kelly spoke with him, the number of locals in the village quietly increased. A crowd formed in the yard of the chief's house, pressing in until the visiting sailors were surrounded. What happened next unfolded in seconds. A sudden shout rose and the mood flipped from welcome to violence. Kelly saw men thrown down and seized in the crush. Several of his crew were pinned by the mob. Tucker and 2 others broke free and ran for the boat, where they found the man left on guard already injured, staggering near the waterline with blood on his head. With no sign that the others could escape, the survivors shoved the boat into the surf and tried to pull away from the beach. Kelly, meanwhile, was fighting for his life among the huts and fences of the village yard. He had a heavy cutting tool in his hand and used it at close range, forcing a gap through the attackers. A spear went through his left hand, but he got clear, stumbling toward the shore as the crowd pressed behind him. On the sand he caught sight of one crewmate lying motionless. Another had vanished into the confusion. The boat was already backing out through the breakers. Kelly lunged for it, grabbing the gunwale as it lifted and dropped in the surf, and was dragged into deeper water by the pull of his own men. Tucker stayed on the beach, calling out to the locals not to harm the man they knew by his adopted name. For a moment it looked as if familiarity might protect him. It did not. The same attacker Kelly had wounded, still smeared with blood, drove a spear into Tucker's thigh. Tucker fell into the wash at the shoreline, and the men in the boat could only watch from a few yards away as he was struck again and then torn apart in the surf. He had time for one last plea, begging not to be abandoned, before the crowd carried what was left of him away from the water. When Kelly reached the Sophia, more danger waited. Several locals from the settlement visited the day before were already on board. Kelly forced them back ashore and cut contact immediately, continuing his voyage with a bitter lesson. He later blamed the decision to land unarmed, a choice urged by Tucker and supported by other crewmen who believed the coast was safe. Kelly also suspected another force at work: revenge. Some communities along that coast carried memories of earlier shootings by foreign crews, and the price was now being taken from whoever stepped onto the sand without protection. The violence of the sealing era did not fall on one side alone. Many captains and mates in that trade were feared even by their own crews. Some smuggled runaway convicts aboard, then worked them harder than any prison gang, treating them as disposable labour on distant islands. Reports reached authorities that an American ship had sailed with numerous escapees among its hands. When officials finally checked, several men were found in a state of filth and exhaustion, bearing signs of brutal punishment. Some of their companions had been dumped on a lonely island to kill seals, with only a promise that a ship might return later. For those men, the ocean was not a route to freedom, but another kind of sentence, one that could end quietly in a nameless grave. Stories like these continued into the 1820s. A Sydney brig arrived from the western coast with skins and a group of 7 men who claimed to have fled a hostile shoreline after locals killed members of their sealing gang. Their leader was an officer from an American vessel. Suspicion followed them. A rescue party went ashore, seized the men as possible runaways, and brought them back under arrest. Only one turned out to be a fugitive. The rest were free sailors caught in the paranoia of the time. The captain who detained them escaped serious punishment. But the episode showed how quickly fear could turn into wrongdoing, even among Europeans. In 1824, another vessel was blown into a narrow strait by contrary winds. For a day or two, the crew gathered wood and water and traded calmly, believing themselves on friendly terms. Then the master and 5 men went ashore unarmed, with no argument or warning beforehand. They had barely stepped onto the beach when a group rushed them and killed them with clubs. The ship weighed anchor at once and fled back across the sea, carrying only the news. Despite the risks, the industry remained busy. Multiple ships worked the coasts and outlying islands each season, chasing profits that still looked enormous on paper. Tens of thousands of skins moved through Sydney each year, along with large quantities of oil rendered from sea elephants. Prices made the trade tempting. A single skin could sell for the equivalent of many days' wages. But the slaughter was already hollowing out the very resource the trade depended on. Crews killed breeding females and pups for food as readily as for skins, stripping beaches that had once seemed endless. By the mid-1820s, ships were sailing longer and returning with far less. One brig spent half a year searching for fresh ground and came back with only a small bundle of fur, hardly enough to justify the voyage. Within a few years, sealing in nearby waters collapsed almost completely. Exports fell sharply, and the occasional large return stood out like the last flare of a dying fire. Along the southern coast, another legacy appeared: children of mixed ancestry and European men living permanently among local communities. Some foreigners had been there for decades, long before officials paid serious attention to the region. In many cases, these relationships were not casual arrangements. Local women anchored households, secured food, and offered protection through kinship ties. The outsider, rough as he often was, effectively joined the tribe by marriage and obligation. Compared with the violence further south in other island chains, these men could be better fed and better sheltered. Not because they were stronger, but because they became part of local networks that made survival possible. Over time, daily life in these households changed in visible ways. Wooden houses appeared with chimneys, European clothing mixed with local styles. New foods spread through the camps. Children learned different habits: washing, combing hair, eating baked bread and salted pork alongside traditional staples. Some outsiders discouraged practices they found shocking and praised customs they admired. Yet the picture was never simple. Many of these men were fugitives or hardened criminals who carried drink, cruelty, and foul language into their new homes. Even so, fragments of routine followed them. A day of rest each week, the idea of rules for children, and the stubborn attempt to build a small private world at the edge of the known map. As sealing declined, attention turned toward another prize: timber and flax. Sydney merchants had long believed New Zealand's plant fibres could become a major trade, even after earlier massacres frightened investors. More than once, parties were sent across the water to establish small collecting stations, only to fail when supply ships did not arrive on schedule, or when the work proved too slow to pay. The problem was not the plant itself. The fibre was strong. The obstacle was preparation. Without efficient tools, turning tough leaves into clean, exportable fibre demanded exhausting hand labour. Exploring Voyagers began to map the harbours of the far south while testing the flax fields. Surveyors reported that flax did not blanket the land everywhere. It often grew thick around lagoons and marshes, then disappeared quickly into brush and forest. They experimented with dressing the fibre and found it could yield a large portion of its weight when properly cleaned, but the process consumed time and strength on a scale that made profit uncertain. They concluded that serious production would require heavy investment and better technology than the traders possessed. Not all encounters were marked by bloodshed. There were moments of extraordinary generosity. In one case, a ship reached an Otago Bay in distress, her crew weakened by hunger and disease and nearly out of water. A local chief responded by organising fishing parties, distributing potatoes, and helping haul heavy casks from a distant water source when the exhausted sailors could not manage the work. He even sat on deck with his people and began making rope from flax using local methods, producing cordage strong enough to replace decayed rigging. The captain left with deep respect for the man, describing leadership that felt more like a protective father than a tyrant. Other trading ventures ended in disaster. 2 vessels pursuing flax were attacked after weeks of outward friendliness. Canoes crowded alongside at midday, and armed men suddenly surged onto the decks. Officers were struck down. Crews fired from below through hatchways and used every angle of the ship to drive attackers back. At one point, the situation became so desperate that sailors considered destroying their own vessel rather than being taken alive. Cables were cut, Both ships drifted towards shore, and the fight dragged on for hours before musket fire finally cleared the decks. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Later accounts pointed to earlier thefts, deception in trade, and abuses that had poisoned relations long before the first club was raised. Even when flax cargoes reached Sydney, the trade remained unstable. Rope makers tested the fibre against imported cordage and boasted of its strength. Shipments increased. Premiums were offered overseas to encourage cultivation. For a brief period, New Zealand flax looked like it might become a cornerstone commodity. Then quality fell. Bales arrived dirty, poorly sorted, and sometimes packed dishonestly. Prices dropped, companies collapsed before they truly began, and traders searched for substitutes. Attempts to grow the plant elsewhere and process it with convict labour brought disappointing results. The reality on the ground was always labour. Cleaning flax by hand was slow, repetitive work, often done by women and enslaved people within local communities. Traders depended on those workers and paid in tobacco, small goods, and basic supplies. Storage houses rose in villages, long sheds built from poles and reed thatch, where prepared fibre was kept under strict rules that discouraged theft. Many settlements hosted a single resident foreign trader, protected by a chief and tied into the community through marriage. He usually dealt only with that one group, because stepping beyond tribal boundaries could mean losing protection overnight. By the 1830s, the flax trade expanded into a complex web of stations and collectors living deep in contested districts, sometimes in places where conflict could ignite without warning. A trader might be asked to move his operation because a village planned to relocate closer to its gardens, making transport easier. In such a world, commerce followed the rhythms of local power, seasonal labour, and fragile alliances rather than the plans of distant investors. For the men who chased profit across these coasts, the sea was only the first hazard. The real danger waited on shore, inside the shifting rules of a land where friendship could be genuine, but never guaranteed. In the early 1830s, tensions around the flax trade often turned small disputes into sudden bloodshed. At one lakeside station, a large canoe was brought to carry the traders' goods to a new site, as local leaders had requested. Half the cargo was already loaded when an argument broke out between the crew and several villagers. The quarrel escalated without warning. A powerful man seized the English agent and tried to drag him into the canoe. The trader drew a short blade in self-defense, but it was torn from his hand. Only the appearance of a pistol drove the attacker back. The first victim was the man who had been working in the canoe. He was thrown into the water and held under by several assailants, who killed him with knives while the surface turned red around them. The surviving Europeans ran to a nearby hut, determined to resist as long as they could. Hundreds gathered outside, shouting and trying to pull the walls apart. For a few desperate minutes, the two traders kept them away with firearms, while a small group of younger chiefs attempted to protect the strangers. These men formed a ring around the fragile shelter, brushing away burning brands that were hurled onto the reed roof. The noise was deafening, mixed with the grim celebration of those dividing the body of the murdered sailor. After nearly half an hour, the rage began to cool. The same young chiefs entered the hut and led the traders out, assuring them the danger had passed. When asked why the attack had occurred, the reply was blunt. The foreigners had no right to move their business from the island. The chief, who had urged the relocation, avoided answering. In a sudden reversal, the remaining goods were carried back to the canoe, and most of what had been stolen was returned as if the violence had been nothing more than a misunderstanding. The principal instigator approached the shaken men and performed a ritual lament, a gesture that convinced no one of his sincerity. Only a few fragments of their companion's body could be recovered. They were burned with the hut before the traders abandoned the station for good. Similar stories echoed along other rivers. In 1832, a young merchant named Thomas Ralph lived among the Maniapoto people on the Mokau River, managing a store of flax for a Sydney firm. When the local warriors marched south on a campaign, the village was left almost empty, guarded only by 2 elderly men and an old woman. A rival group seized the opportunity and descended on the deserted settlement. The woman was killed, and at nightfall the raiders surrounded Ralph's house. They argued fiercely about his fate. Some wanted to kill him and share the body. Others hoped to sell him as a slave for a high ransom. At dawn, Ralph was dragged outside to face the crowd. Men fought among themselves to claim him, nearly cutting him down in the struggle. His death was postponed only because the chiefs could not agree on how to divide the remains. His Maori wife, the daughter of an important leader, was torn away from him, and the house was broken open. Goods were looted, and 20 tons of prepared flax were burned in a heap that lit the valley. Stripped to a single shirt, Ralph was forced to march with the raiders through dense forest, his bare feet torn on rock and thorn. Food was scarce, and what little they carried, fern root and half-ripe potatoes, was shared grudgingly. He begged to be allowed to reach the coast and promised any ransom they demanded. But the chiefs refused. They valued him more as a living captive than as a corpse that would only provoke new quarrels. In despair, he tried to escape one night, stumbling blindly through the bush until shouts revealed his trail. The pursuers approached with raised axes, yet one young leader threw himself over Ralph's body and saved him. Even then, a musket was pressed to his head and misfired before another chief intervened. Months later, a message reached a sympathetic captain on the Kauai River, who finally arranged payment for Ralph's release. While traders struggled to survive on shore, a different drama unfolded on the sea. Missionary leaders in New South Wales had long dreamed of carrying their work to New Zealand, but the memory of earlier massacres made such plans risky. The chaplain Samuel Marsden believed that peaceful commerce and practical skills must prepare the way for religion. With government permission, he purchased a small brig to link the 2 colonies and sent a scouting party to the Bay of Islands. The explorers returned with encouraging reports and, more importantly, with several influential chiefs willing to visit Sydney and see European life for themselves. These guests were taken to farms and workshops, shown ploughs, looms, brick kilns, and gardens heavy with unfamiliar crops. The intention was simple: to let them witness the benefits of another way of living, rather than hear distant promises. Marsden hoped that such experiences would make the island leaders eager to host teachers and craftsmen among their own people. By late 1814, preparations were complete for a first official mission voyage. Notices appeared in Sydney announcing Marsden's temporary absence and appointing a resident magistrate in the Bay of Islands to protect local people from abuse by visiting sailors. The ship that sailed in November carried a remarkable company. Mission families, with their children, seamen, convicts placed under bond, and several Māori chiefs returning home. Livestock, tools, and crates of poultry crowded the deck beside goats, dogs, and cats. Observers compared the scene to a floating ark, a fragile experiment launched into uncertain waters. Bad weather delayed the departure, and during those anxious days, rumours reached the chiefs that the missionaries would bring crowds of settlers who might enslave or destroy them, as had happened elsewhere. Marsden answered not with argument, but with a simple offer to abandon the project and return everyone to Sydney if trust was lost. The challenge restored their confidence, and the brig finally cleared the harbour at the end of November. The first meetings aboard the mission brig were filled with the kind of amazement that only happens when 2 worlds collide without warning. For For the visiting islanders, almost every corner of the ship offered something unfamiliar to stare at, touch, or question. The livestock caused the greatest shock. Cows and horses were unlike anything they had known, so large and strangely shaped that one man, seeing a cow bend its head to feed, asked with genuine urgency where its mouth was meant to be. Even ordinary routines became performances. When the chaplain shaved on deck, the visitors watched as if spellbound. One of them stared so hard his jaw hung open the entire time and only closed when the razor was put away. A simple looking glass produced another burst of wonder. When their own faces appeared in the glass, they sprang back, laughing and calling out, reacting with delight as though the reflection were a living trick. While the chief's messengers were away fetching supplies, canoes began to arrive from the shore. The first were trading canoes stacked with fish, and the bargaining was brisk and almost casual. A single small nail could buy a heavy fish, and the sailors quickly learned how far such a tiny piece of iron could go. Not long after, a different kind of canoe glided up, longer, more crowded, built for intimidation as much as travel. These were war canoes, carrying dozens of armed men and a collection of goods meant for exchange. Trade still continued, but the mood changed. The deck that had been filled with laughter a short time before now carried a sharper edge. All day, more canoes came and went, until the light began to fade and the chiefs who had gone inland returned with green feed for the animals, and news that, for the moment, the fighting nearby had settled. The chaplain wanted to sleep ashore among the people who had been visiting the ship, but the local leaders refused to allow it. They treated the idea as unnecessary risk, the sort of mistake that could turn friendly hours into a disaster. The next stage of the voyage carried the brig into a bay already marked by earlier encounters between islanders and outsiders. Its landmarks still held memories of men taken away years before, of distant islands where they had lived for a time and learned foreign skills. Place names echoed those older journeys, as if the coastline itself had been collecting reminders of contact long before a mission ever arrived. From there, the ship moved along to the entrance of a harbour known for its dangerous reputation, since a notorious massacre that had made crews cautious and rumours even louder. The mission's chosen settlement site was close enough that hostility in this area could threaten everything. The chaplain also needed to hear local explanations of the earlier bloodshed, not only the version repeated in ports far away. Rather than waiting for chiefs to come aboard, the mission party went ashore with their principal allies and walked into a community still watched with suspicion by neighbouring groups. The visit had the atmosphere of a test. Polite greetings on the surface, old grievances underneath, and a careful reading of every gesture. They passed through low ground and scrub before reaching a hill where a war party was camped. Around 150 men were gathered there under several leaders, and the arrival of Europeans in such a place was not treated as ordinary. The visitors were welcomed, but the welcome was framed by power. A war dance was performed. Food was prepared. The camp itself showed a society that could shift quickly between ceremony and violence. The chiefs stood out by their clothing. Cloaks edged with dog fur, bright borders woven into mats, red-dyed fibres that gave the garments a vivid, almost theatrical look. Weapons were everywhere, spears of different lengths, clubs of bone, axes, fighting staffs, carried with the casual confidence of men used to them. Hair was bound high and decorated with white feathers. Some wore trophies and ornaments taken from enemies or from earlier ships. When the Europeans ate, the camp crowded around them so closely that nothing escaped notice. It was not simple curiosity. It was inspection. The way food was handled, the way it was swallowed, the way utensils were used. Everything drew comment. Yet amid the noise, there were also older men who watched without expression, as if more interested in the reasons behind the visit than in the surface spectacle. The visitors noticed details of daily life that felt puzzling: eating in a shed outside the sleeping house, and women taking meals apart from men. Such customs were recorded because no one on the ship could yet explain them. That night, the party slept ashore, surrounded by the same people who had been blamed for earlier killings, and listened as those people gave their own account of what had happened and why. At dawn, a strange scene unfolded. Bodies stretched across the open ground in every direction, mats damp with night dew, warriors stirring with weapons planted upright beside them. Several leaders were invited back to the ship for breakfast, and before they left, gifts were chosen: cloth, tools, nails, hooks, objects that carried weight far beyond their cost. The distribution was done with strict attention to age and rank, and the visitors were also given written notices meant to restrain future abuses by sailors. The meaning was explained as best it could be. Then the chiefs returned to shore and the brig continued its passage. A few days later, the ship entered the Bay of Islands with a salute. The landing place looked like a narrow valley cut between steep, fern-covered hills, with a stream winding down toward the sea. Above it stood a fortified settlement that served as a political centre and a symbol of protection. People gathered quickly along the shore: men, women, children, showing unmistakable excitement. The chaplain's name was already known there, and the reception was warmer than many outsiders expected. Then the animals were brought ashore, and the crowd's confidence dissolved into panic. A cow, wild and impatient, broke into the gathering and sent people running as though a monster had been unleashed. When the animal was controlled, they returned cautiously, and the chaplain climbed onto a horse and rode along the beach. That sight, man and horse moving as one, was more shocking than the livestock itself. Stories told earlier by the local chief, based on what he had seen in the colonies, had sounded like wild invention. He had tried to explain that enormous dogs could carry humans and pull land canoes, and people had mocked him. Some had even tried riding pigs to prove how ridiculous the idea was, tumbling into the dirt and laughing at their own failure. Now the horse was standing in front of them, undeniable. For the chief, who had insisted it was real, it became a personal victory. While this was happening on the beach, the mission women visited the chief's wife and were shown local clothing, the wearing of flax mats, the domestic routines of the settlement. Their arrival mattered in a different way. Women from overseas had been seen here before, but the new arrivals represented a different status and a different future, and the distinction did not go unnoticed. Years of contact with whalers had already changed social habits in this region, and some local women had learned to use that contact to their advantage. Outsiders observed this with a mix of fascination and discomfort, noting how quickly a port culture could grow around a harbour where ships came and went. As the days passed, the chief staged a mock sea battle for entertainment. Canoes crossed the bay in formation, leaders standing upright, spears raised, shouting challenges. Feathered hair, painted faces, cloaks thrown back to show movement, everything combined into a scene that looked like war, even when everyone knew it was theatre. At the same time, the mission party kept distance from disputes they did not understand. When a serious domestic offence was tried locally, advice was sought from the chaplain, and punishment was carried out according to his suggestion. Observers also recorded the local rules surrounding such matters, rules that could seem harsh and uneven, and which revealed how strongly order was enforced within the community. One day carried special symbolic weight: Christmas. Wanting to honour it, the leading chief threw together a simple place of worship using timber and the remains of an old canoe. A desk was improvised, seating was arranged, and a flagstaff was raised on the highest ground. When morning came and a foreign flag flew above the settlement, the chaplain saw it as a sign that a new era might begin. The entire ship's company went ashore for the service, leaving only 2 men aboard. Chiefs appeared wearing military coats given to them in the colonies, swords at their sides, switches in their hands to keep their followers in order. Their men stood in lines on each side of the Europeans. Women and children formed a wide ring around all of them. Silence fell across the gathering. The service began with singing. The preacher delivered a message of joy and good news, but the listeners could not grasp the meaning. The chief reassured them that understanding would come later and offered his own explanation in simple terms. Whatever the deeper purpose, the event fixed something in place. An image of order, ceremony, and controlled contact, performed publicly in the heart of a fortified village. Work started almost immediately after. A large house was begun for the mission families, long and narrow, divided into separate living spaces. A forge was set up. Charcoal was made. Saws cut timber. People on shore moved into a rhythm of building, washing, cooking, and adapting. The newcomers began to look less like temporary visitors and more like residents. Within weeks, the brig was ready to sail again on a coastal voyage, leaving the station behind with only basic security and the goodwill of the chiefs who had chosen to protect it. Daily life at the new settlement offered endless scenes of mutual observation. Nothing drew attention like the blacksmith. Villagers sat for hours in the forge watching iron soften under heat, then harden again under the hammer. Sparks flew, and many kept their distance as if the fire itself might leap onto their mats. Someone played a prank, shaking a man's cloak and shouting a warning about flames. The man sprang away with astonishing speed, bolting from the forge before anyone could stop laughing. Curiosity never seemed to tire. Crowds pressed around doors from morning to night simply to watch how foreigners ate, washed, worked, and spoke. Chiefs pushing inside often left behind dirt and parasites, and the mission households learned quickly that constant visitors came with constant strain. Despite all this, theft was limited. Leaders understood that stealing from the newcomers could poison the relationship they were trying to build. In this region, maintaining trade and access to tools mattered, and the chiefs used honor, authority, and taboo to keep order. Before the mission leader departed, a further step was taken. An agreement was made for the land the settlers were occupying. The document was prepared in advance and completed with local marks and symbols instead of signatures. Then the ground was declared restricted, protected for the use of the foreigners unless permission was given. By late February, the chaplain's official leave was nearly over, and preparations for departure began. The purpose of the journey had been achieved in practical terms. A service had been held, the settlers had been established, buildings had gone up, and the first fragile routines of a station had begun. No one expected immediate conversion, and none had happened. Yet a child was born among the newcomers and was baptized in front of local witnesses, a small act offered as proof that the settlement was meant to last. Behind the scenes, darker realities continued. The chief who had anchored much of the mission's safety was gravely ill. A traditional priest guarded him closely, and access became difficult. Soon after the brig left, he died, and his principal wife took her own life in the belief that she should follow him into the next world. The mission remained, but it remained on borrowed time, planted in contested ground and dependent on alliances that could vanish with a single death. A crowd gathered to watch the ships sail, and chiefs promised protection for the settlers now that the old leader was gone. Several young men of rank chose to travel back with the chaplain to the colonies, joining the returning passengers, and a handful of convicts being taken back under supervision. The brig moved out past familiar headlands, paused again for supplies, collected flax for the return cargo, then turned towards Sydney. When it arrived in early March, the leader reported back to the governor at once, his absence now complete. The settlement he left behind was still in its infancy, trying to teach new crafts and new beliefs in a place where the language was barely understood. Local rules were still mysterious, and the tools of instruction were few. What existed so far was not a finished mission, but an experiment. A small foreign foothold held together by timber, trade goods, uneasy trust, and the hope that contact might become something other than fear. In the years after regular contact began between New South Wales and the islands to the east, a quiet but important idea took shape in Paramatta. Maori visitors were arriving there with increasing frequency, often staying for months at a time in the household of Samuel Marsden. By 1810, he already had several young men from New Zealand living under his roof, some of them sons of influential chiefs. From these informal beginnings grew the notion of a small school where selected youths could be taught the practical skills of European life and then carry that knowledge back across the sea. The plan was not to create scholars in the classical sense, but to introduce arts that might alter daily existence. Working flax into twine and canvas, forging simple tools, learning the routines of farming and animal care. Those who supported the proposal believed such an establishment would serve two purposes. It would benefit the young men themselves and at the same time provide a measure of security for the European settlers in New Zealand, since the pupils would, in effect, be guests and pledges for the good treatment of their relatives at home. The projected cost was modest, and before long the first group of students was formed from youths already living in Paramatta. Reports from the period describe the early progress with cautious optimism. By 1817, more than a dozen Māori were attached to the seminary, and observers remarked on their orderly conduct. A few had begun to speak English with confidence, and one was able to spin a serviceable web of canvas from native flax. The following year the number fluctuated around a dozen. Some learned rope making, others worked in gardens and fields, and several prepared to return to their own country aboard the mission brig. The institution was still small, yet it had become a visible part of colonial life. Marsden believed deeply in the experiment. He acquired land across the river from Paramatta and began to erect solid buildings of local stone, imagining a place where visiting missionaries might stay and where young islanders could live and work together. He hoped that when a chief's son had mastered the plough or the management of cattle, he might be allowed to take those animals home, proof that new habits could be carried across the water. To him, the seminary was not merely a school, but a bridge between two worlds. By the end of the decade, more than 20 young New Zealanders had passed through his care. Contemporary accounts praise their behaviour and curiosity. They wandered through orchards and vineyards in wonder at fruit trees, unknown at home, and asked endless questions about the unseen maker of such abundance. Many found it difficult to believe that the same creator could have fashioned both the ordered farms of the colony and the wild landscapes of their own islands. These conversations, Marsden felt, were as valuable as any formal lesson. Yet the enterprise was never simple. The change of climate and diet proved hard on the visitors, and illness took several lives. Between 1819 and 1820, a number of promising youths died, either in New South Wales or soon after returning home. Surprisingly, these losses did not discourage further interest. Chiefs continued to press for places for their children, convinced that even at risk the benefits of European knowledge were worth pursuing. Still, the heavy demands of care led to the temporary suspension of the seminary, and instruction continued only in a more informal way whenever islanders happened to be in the colony. Marsden remained convinced that the idea must be revived on a firmer footing. After his later journeys to New Zealand, he returned determined to rebuild the institution. This time with room also for the children of the growing missionary families. A new site with good water was chosen, and by the mid-1820s the main building and its wings were complete. A handful of Maori youths again lived there, learning trades from a resident weaver and working beside settlers in the fields. Visitors to Paramatta remarked that these students, once fierce in appearance, seemed altered, calmer in manner, eager to practice English, and proud to demonstrate the skills they had acquired. Parallel with these educational efforts, another form of contact was unfolding along the coasts of New Zealand. Traders from Sydney were beginning to recognise the value of the vast forests that fringed many harbours. Early in the century, a few adventurous captains loaded their ships with long spars cut by Maori labour, and colonial newspapers advertised the New Zealand pine as a novelty on the Sydney market. Duties were imposed and later reduced as officials tried to encourage the trade. The timber, especially the mighty kauri, promised to be of great importance to the Navy, which struggled to find masts long enough for its largest ships. Tension sometimes accompanied this commerce. Crews feared attack from warriors who had learned the power of European weapons, and rumours circulated of plots to seize visiting vessels. Yet the trade continued, and by 1820 the British government sent 2 naval store ships to investigate the forests directly. Their officers explored the rivers of the north, measuring trees and sounding bars, while Maori chiefs debated the terms on which the strangers might cut timber from their lands. The encounters were cautious but generally peaceful, each side testing the other's intentions. Through these varied enterprises, schools in Paramatta, timber camps on distant shores, conversations held on the decks of anchored ships, the relationship between the two peoples slowly changed. Young men who had once known only their own villages learned to handle ploughs and hammers. Sailors who had expected hostility discovered curiosity and hospitality instead. The transformation was uneven and often fragile, shadowed by disease and misunderstanding. Yet a new pattern of exchange was taking shape, one that would reshape both New Zealand and the colony across the Tasman in ways few at the time could fully imagine. Accounts from the naval expedition described the Hokianga as a place where first impressions quickly challenged the fears that often followed European ships along the northern coast. The local communities had not yet been drawn deeply into regular overseas trade, and that very distance from earlier contacts seemed to sharpen their eagerness. Food had already been gathered from far inland. Pigs, potatoes, and other produce were ready, waiting only for calm water and a safe moment to bring canoes alongside and bargain. Observers noted a different social atmosphere from the one more commonly reported at the Bay of Islands. The people were described as steady workers, less quick to provoke conflict and more clearly directed by their leaders. When a small colonial schooner entered the river ahead of the larger supply ship, the scene looked threatening at first. War canoes surrounded the vessel, and with only a handful of crew on board, the commander had reason to expect trouble. Instead, the tension eased almost immediately. A respected chief stepped aboard, signalled that the ship would be treated as protected, and the next days were marked by gestures that carried real weight. Baskets of food were delivered regularly, not only to the schooner but even to the visiting boats from the larger ship, whenever they happened to put in to shore. While this cautious goodwill unfolded on the west coast, the main expedition still faced an urgent question in the Bay of Islands. Time was being lost while crews searched for the right timber, because not every tall tree served the Navy's purpose. A party was sent up the Kawakawa to examine what grew along the banks and to judge whether a workable cargo could be assembled if the most desired timber could not be found. Local leaders offered practical arrangements. One prominent chief proposed a clear exchange: axes for spars. with the promise that the logs would be floated downriver. It sounded efficient, and for a moment it seemed the problem might be solved, with straightforward bargaining. Another store ship arrived soon after, assigned to the same mission of gathering long spars for imperial use. Yet even with 2 vessels working the region, early results were not convincing. The second ship did not remain long in the Bay of Islands. After only a short stay, it headed south toward the Thames, carrying a small group of influential Maori passengers and a European clergyman who was widely known to coastal communities. At the same time, information returned from scouts sent toward Whangaroa. Reports described unusually polite treatment there, and more importantly, forests said to be rich in the prized kauri. That changed the calculation. The Kawakawa had produced only a limited number of spars, and they were from a different species than the one most wanted. The decision was made to shift operations and chase the stronger promise. The store ship entered Whangaroa and settled in for what became a long, grinding season. Months passed as the cargo slowly took shape. The work behind those impressive masts was not the clean, triumphant story that readers often imagine when they hear about naval timber. It was closer to a logistics campaign fought against landscape and weather. A road had to be cut through heavy ground, stretching more than a mile across clay that broke apart under rain. The trees selected for masts stood in difficult country, deep in gullies and ravines. Simply dropping them was only the start. The trunks had to be trimmed where they fell to reduce weight and remove branches, then hauled up to higher ground. A capstan was set on a ridge, and the spars were dragged upward by sheer force, rope, and stubborn repetition. Progress was slow for reasons that never looked dramatic on paper, but ruled every day in the field. The distance between capstan and tree could be great. Stumps snagged the tackle. Wet ground swallowed men's footing and strained ropes until they snapped. Lines fouled, jammed, and had to be reset. It was the kind of labour where one bad hour could erase half a day's effort. In some stretches, a single spar could cost 2 full days of continuous work, with crews starting before sunrise and stopping only when light finally failed. Shelter offered little relief. Men lived in rough huts that kept out neither damp nor wind. Food grew monotonous and uncertain, especially for a ship held in one place for so long that fresh supplies could not always be secured. By late in the year, the cargo was complete and the store ship finally left New Zealand waters, touched at Sydney, and then continued on to England. Another vessel returned from the Thames with her own load of spars, and her voyage became tied to separate stories of missionary movement and coastal travel. What mattered here was the pattern becoming clearer. The timber trade was no longer a minor sideline. It was turning into a system that pulled ships repeatedly into the same harbours, forced negotiations with local leaders, and created a new kind of dependency, where axes, iron, and tools became the currency for trees that would be transformed into imperial hardware. Hokianga, despite the early praise, did not immediately fill the written record in the same way as the Bay of Islands. Mentions were scattered, as if the place sat just beyond the main spotlight of early colonial narratives. Still, when ships did appear there, certain details stood out. A wreck on that coast produced the kind of test that revealed more than polite speeches ever could. The survivors expected the worst and prepared themselves for abandonment, violence, or theft. Instead, they found care. Food was provided, shelter was offered. A local chief not only supplied provisions for the overland journey, but organised an escort to protect the crew as they crossed towards safer and more familiar districts. The captain who later wrote about the incident did not pretend the wreck was anything but complete loss, but he emphasised that the treatment received was kinder than he had imagined possible. Around the same period, missionary life in the Bay of Islands entered a more unsettled and revealing phase. Once the founding party had been put ashore, the settlement faced pressures that were less about preaching and more about the practical risks of living as a small, exposed group among powerful communities. Some of the Europeans had arrived with trade goods of their own, and at first they assumed they might barter privately for profit. Later, the mission leadership decided that private trading would be dangerous. The fear was that competition for advantage would provoke resentment, undermine trust, and turn the settlement into a marketplace driven by individual greed rather than collective purpose. A firm rule was laid down. Trade would be conducted for the common interest, and any profits would be used to support the community's needs. That decision did not come without friction. Skilled workers in young colonies could earn strong incomes, and the temptation to treat a remote mission as a direct route to wealth was real. Still, an arrangement emerged. Supplies would be bought into common stock. Rations would be distributed, and the proceeds of any cargo sent back to New South Wales would be shared on a modest, fixed basis. The aim was to keep the settlement stable and to avoid the kind of internal rivalry that could be fatal in an unfamiliar and sometimes volatile environment. A small population remained at the mission station. Families, a few hired workers such as sawyers and a blacksmith, and several runaway convicts pressed into service until the next ship could remove them. The overall number was tiny by any standard, and their safety depended heavily on relationships with local leaders. That dependence became painfully clear when illness struck one of the most important figures connected to the mission's survival. Ruatara, the chief who had been central to the early welcome and to the mission's hopes, fell dangerously ill. The first response from his people was to place him under strict sacred restriction. A guard was set, and outsiders were kept away. The enclosure around him became untouchable by ordinary rules. Even repeated requests to see him were refused. Food and drink were limited by custom, and the sick man lay exposed in the sun with fever and pain. Only after days of tense negotiation did permission come. When access was granted, provisions were brought: tea, sugar, rice, wine, and other comforts that were scarce and precious. His condition lifted briefly, then worsened again. Objects used in his care became sacred and could not be reclaimed, adding another layer of cost and complication for a settlement already short on resources. After the ship carrying the mission leader departed, the illness deepened. Ruatara was carried to a prepared place on a hill, where he intended a new settlement might one day rise. There, he tried to shape the future with the authority of a dying man. He instructed how his few prized possessions should be divided, set aside gifts that were meant for his child, and requested that his son should eventually be raised and educated, far away in the colony across the sea. Within a day, he was dead. In the days that followed, leading chiefs reassured the missionaries that protection would continue. Promises were made that the death of one patron did not mean open season on the settlement. Yet stability was never guaranteed. Rivalries and old injuries remained, and violence could flare from causes as small as a quarrel over crops. Raids followed disputes. Animals gifted as symbols of new alliances were killed in retaliation. Reports came in from the south of killings and captives, reminders that intertribal warfare was not a distant background, but a living, moving force that could sweep into any harbour with little warning. At the same time, delegations continued to visit the mission, sometimes arriving in dozens of canoes and hundreds of people. The missionaries measured the great war canoes and recorded numbers with a mixture of awe and anxiety, because the size of a visiting party could signal either commerce or danger. Yet alongside fear, there were moments that showed deliberate restraint. When a saw was stolen, a leader ordered it returned. visitors did not want to deepen their reputation for lawlessness. They understood that their future access to European goods depended on maintaining workable relations. Trade ships passed through the bay frequently enough to tie the mission's fate to the wider maritime world. Convicts who had escaped from New South Wales were delivered back to authority. Chiefs and attendants travelled across the Tasman, watched colonial life, attended church services, and asked questions that revealed sharp intelligence. Names and titles shifted as islanders adapted foreign concepts to local status. Some visitors were fascinated by the machinery of government and the meaning of punishment. Others were drawn by the simple fact that iron, tools, and cloth flowed through this new relationship like power made tangible. Not all threats came from Māori. European crews could be reckless, drunk, and violent, and the missionaries sometimes found themselves in the strange position of being protected by armed locals against their own countrymen. In one recorded incident, sailors broke into a missionary's house in anger over a dispute, only to retreat when a large group of armed Maori arrived to defend the settlement. It was an inversion that revealed the true balance on the ground. European authority was not automatic in New Zealand, and safety often depended on the goodwill of chiefs rather than on distant imperial law. Attempts to expand the mission's footprint showed how quickly geography could turn ideal plans into disaster. Waitangi was described as rich land, well suited for cattle and timber work, and a purchase was made to secure it for the mission. A small house was built, sawyers were sent, gardens were planted, and fences erected. The place produced vegetables quickly, and grain was harvested within months. A flagstaff rose as a public marker of the weekly holy day. On paper, it looked like progress. Then, reality struck. Strangers arrived, violence erupted, and the settlement was looted. A missionary was thrown down and threatened with weapons. His wife was struck, her face bloodied. Tools, cooking gear, bedding, and firearms were taken. The attackers moved fast and would have carried off more if help had not arrived. The incident proved what experienced leaders already suspected. Rich land without strong local protection was a trap. The settlers pulled back, assisted by a passing ship, and the plan was abandoned. Back at the original station, work continued in a fragile rhythm, sowing wheat for chiefs, attempting to teach children, and managing endless visitors whose curiosity was constant and intense. The mission school attracted crowds as soon as even minimal accommodation existed. Some students learned quickly, and early primers were produced. 2 young Maori later travelled to England and became minor public curiosities, presenting themselves as converts and assisting, at least in part, with language work that outsiders hoped would make future communication easier. Their journey was long and difficult, marked by sickness, repairs and delays, but it fed a growing belief in Britain that these islands were entering a new era of contact. Through all of this, a consistent theme ran beneath the names, voyages and arguments. Trade, timber, education and religion were not separate stories. They were strands of the same tightening web. Axes could buy spars. Iron could buy food. A school could become a political tool by bringing rival chiefs' sons into one household. A mission could survive not through moral authority, but through alliances strong enough to deter violence. And a single death, like Ruatara's, could expose just how dependent the newcomers were on local power. Around this period, the small European community at the Bay of Islands began to take on the character of a working village rather than a fragile outpost. One of the settlers, Mr. King, had constructed a simple rope walk and was patiently showing local men how to spin twine and twist cords. He had also broken ground for wheat and for half a year kept several labourers employed. feeding them at his own table and paying for their work with goods they valued. The sight of Maori learning unfamiliar trades was still new. Yet it suggested that the relationship between the two peoples was slowly moving beyond barter toward cooperation. The mission was joined by Charles Gordon, a relative of Carlyle, who agreed to oversee farming for 3 years. His arrival coincided with growing evidence of how strongly the desire for iron-shaped native behaviour. Anything made of metal became irresistible. A wheelbarrow was torn apart for its fittings, a house was partly dismantled for its nails, and even a boat was broken up to obtain the precious fragments. Such incidents alarmed the settlers, but many still believed that, considering the vast difference in customs and expectations, the general conduct of the Maori toward them remained better than could have been hoped. Life at the stations was eased by the climate, which visitors repeatedly described as close to ideal. Neither intense heat nor piercing cold troubled the gardens, and crops responded with remarkable vigour. Yet behind this peaceful surface lay problems within the European ranks themselves. Heavy expenses were blamed on the behaviour of several people connected with the supply brig, and for the first time the mission had to confront misconduct among its own. Reports of violence committed by sailors throughout the South Seas reached England and caused deep concern. The Church Missionary Society petitioned the government, arguing that such outrages not only harmed island communities, but also endangered the missionaries who lived among them. They warned that every act of cruelty hardened native attitudes and made trust almost impossible. The memorial urged that British law should follow offenders wherever they sailed, so that murder and plunder would not remain unpunished, simply because they occurred beyond the ordinary reach of courts. While these debates continued far away, daily work at Rangihua and Kerikeri moved forward. By 1818, a school was functioning with encouraging success. Kendall had gained enough command of the language to expand the little primer used for lessons, and attendance at times rose to 70 children. Food supplies determined whether the classrooms were full or empty, for many pupils depended on the settlers for their meals. Among them were orphans and young captives taken in war, living side by side with the sons and daughters of chiefs. The following year, new helpers arrived from England, including the Reverend Butler, a schoolmaster named Francis Hall, and the smith Kemp with his wife. They brought tools, seeds, and fresh energy. Another recruit, James Shepherd, was chosen for his knowledge of gardening and farming. He was instructed to teach the planting of wheat by the dibbling method, which saved seed, and to study the many varieties of native flax in hopes of creating an export trade. The society dreamed not only of a rope walk in New Zealand, but of supplying Britain with strong fibre from these distant shores. Agriculture became the heart of the new station at Kerikeri. Butler delighted in holding the handles of the first plough to cut the northern soil and predicted that future generations would remember the day. Acres of wheat were sown, maize planted, and vines and fruit trees set in orderly rows. Native labourers worked willingly for small rewards, and carpenters began raising solid houses beside the river. The place, only recently a wilderness, started to resemble a small English farmstead. Yet reminders of the surrounding world were never far away. Slaves sometimes died of hunger in the district, and their bodies were left for dogs. Chiefs valued their animals more than such captives. Butler recorded these facts with sorrow, though he also noted long stretches of peace in which families could sleep as calmly as if protected by guards. When Hongi returned from England in 1821, the balance of power shifted. He had seen the might of Europe and understood more clearly the humble position of the missionaries. His prestige at home increased, and the settlers felt the change in his manner. Soon he organised a major war expedition against southern tribes. The fleet of canoes that gathered at Whangarei was immense, and when it came back months later, it carried trophies and prisoners. Scenes of mourning and vengeance followed on the beach, and several captives were killed before the horrified eyes of Europeans who could do nothing to intervene. Amid these tensions, ordinary life persisted. Peach trees, first planted only a year earlier, were already taller than a man, and hops climbed vigorously in Butler's garden. On Sundays, hymns sounded from rough wooden houses, while beyond the hills, warriors prepared for new campaigns. The contrast defined the fragile frontier where two cultures met. The departure of Governor Macquarie from New South Wales in 1822 marked the end of an era that had shaped these beginnings. During his long rule, the colony had grown from a struggling penal station into a place of roads, bridges, hospitals, and churches. His policies of granting land to freed convicts and using their labour for public works had transformed the region that supplied and supported the New Zealand mission. Observers felt that despite many faults, he left behind a society far more confident and ordered than the one he had inherited. Around this period, the small European community at the Bay of Islands began to take on the character of a working village rather than a fragile outpost. One of the settlers, Mr. King, had constructed a simple rope walk and was patiently showing local men how to spin twine and twist cords. He had also broken ground for wheat and for half a year kept several labourers employed, feeding them at his own table and paying for their work with goods they valued. The sight of Maori learning unfamiliar trades was still new, yet it suggested that the relationship between the two peoples was slowly moving beyond barter toward cooperation. The mission was joined by Charles Gordon, a relative of Carlyle, who agreed to oversee farming for 3 years. His arrival coincided with growing evidence of how strongly the desire for iron-shaped native behaviour. Anything made of metal became irresistible. A wheelbarrow was torn apart for its fittings, a house was partly dismantled for its nails, and even a boat was broken up to obtain the precious fragments. Such incidents alarmed the settlers, but many still believed that, considering the vast difference in customs and expectations, the general conduct of the Maori toward them remained better than could have been hoped. Life at the stations was eased by the climate, which visitors repeatedly described as close to ideal. Neither intense heat nor piercing cold troubled the gardens, and crops responded with remarkable vigour. Yet behind this peaceful surface lay problems within the European ranks themselves. Heavy expenses were blamed on the behaviour of several people connected with the supply brig, and for the first time the mission had to confront misconduct among its own. Reports of violence committed by sailors throughout the South Seas reached England and caused deep concern. The Church Missionary Society petitioned the government, arguing that such outrages not only harmed island communities, but also endangered the missionaries who lived among them. They warned that every act of cruelty hardened native attitudes and made trust almost impossible. The memorial urged that British law should follow offenders wherever they sailed, so that murder and plunder would not remain unpunished simply because they occurred beyond the ordinary reach of courts. While these debates continued far away, daily work at Rangihua and Kerikeri moved forward. By 1818, a school was functioning with encouraging success. Kendall had gained enough command of the language to expand the little primer used for lessons, and attendance at times rose to 70 children. Food supplies determined whether the classrooms were full or empty, for many pupils depended on the settlers for their meals. Among them were orphans and young captives taken in war, living side by side with the sons and daughters of chiefs. The following year, new helpers arrived from England, including the Reverend Butler, a schoolmaster named Francis Hall, and the smith Kemp with his wife. They brought tools, seeds, and fresh energy. Another recruit, James Shepherd, was chosen for his knowledge of gardening and farming. He was instructed to teach the planting of wheat by the dibbling method, which saved seed, and to study the many varieties of native flax in hopes of creating an export trade. The society dreamed not only of a rope walk in New Zealand, but of supplying Britain with strong fibre from these distant shores. Agriculture became the heart of the new station at Kerikeri. Butler delighted in holding the handles of the first plough to cut the northern soil and predicted that future generations would remember the day. Acres of wheat were sown, maize planted, and vines and fruit trees set in orderly rows. Native labourers worked willingly for small rewards, and carpenters began raising solid houses beside the river. The place, only recently a wilderness, started to resemble a small English farmstead. Yet reminders of the surrounding world were never far away. Slaves sometimes died of hunger in the district, and their bodies were left for dogs. Chiefs valued their animals more than such captives. Butler recorded these facts with sorrow, though he also noted long stretches of peace in which families could sleep as calmly as if protected by guards. When Hongi returned from England in 1821, the balance of power shifted. He had seen the might of Europe and understood more clearly the humble position of the missionaries. His prestige at home increased, and the settlers felt the change in his manner. Soon he organised a major war expedition against southern tribes. The fleet of canoes that gathered at Whangarei was immense, and when it came back months later it carried trophies and prisoners. Scenes of mourning and vengeance followed on the beach, and several captives were killed before the horrified eyes of Europeans who could do nothing to intervene. Amid these tensions, ordinary life persisted. Peach trees, first planted only a year earlier, were already taller than a man, and hops climbed vigorously in Butler's garden. On Sundays, hymns sounded from rough wooden houses, while beyond the hills, warriors prepared for new campaigns. The contrast defined the fragile frontier where two cultures met. The departure of Governor Macquarie from New South Wales in 1822 marked the end of an era that had shaped these beginnings. During his long rule, the colony had grown from a struggling penal station into a place of roads, bridges, hospitals, and churches. His policies of granting land to freed convicts and using their labour for public works had transformed the region that supplied and supported the New Zealand mission. Observers felt that, despite many faults, he left behind a society far more confident and ordered than the one he had inherited. When the craftsman Cowell reached Port Jackson in May of 1820, the senior missionary Marsden was absent in New Zealand, and several months passed before the two men could meet. Tragedy struck quickly. Cowell's wife fell ill and died after only a few days, leaving him isolated in a strange colony. Other missionaries soon sailed back to New Zealand, yet Cowell remained behind, uncertain of his next step. Only 4 days after the departure of the Maori chief Hongi, he married again, an act that surprised many observers. Even then, he delayed his own voyage and did not finally leave Sydney until the end of January 1822, explaining that his prolonged stay had not been idle. During those months, he experimented with the preparation of New Zealand flax, convinced that this tough native plant could become a valuable export. European hemp, he learned, required one method of treatment, while the Pacific fibre demanded another. In Sydney, he was able to test machines and techniques that could not have been constructed in the islands. He wrote with confidence that he had achieved promising results and believed that the cleaning and weaving of flax might one day draw Maori communities towards settled industry and, through that path, toward what Europeans called civilization. A local merchant, Captain Irvine, supported these efforts and took an active interest in the experiments. Meanwhile, life at the two mission settlements continued to develop. At Rangihua, William Hall reported with satisfaction that he had harvested a fine field of wheat and built a barn large enough to store the grain. The crop would feed his household for the year and provide seed for the next planting. Across the bay at Kerikeri, Butler described a similar scene. Maori labourers were working in the fields, and for the first time the missionaries were able to offer them bread baked from grain grown on their own land. Such small achievements carried enormous symbolic weight. Yet peace was fragile. In February, a war party led by Hongi left the Bay of Islands on another southern expedition. Months later, several chiefs returned, bringing with them the bodies of comrades who had drowned when a canoe overturned in heavy seas. These constant cycles of conflict reminded the settlers how uncertain their position remained. The Missionary Society in England watched events with mixed hope and concern. 2 members were dismissed for behaviour judged disgraceful. A reminder that the Europeans themselves were not immune to failure. At the same time, efforts to educate Maori children expanded. Teachers visited nearby villages, explaining Christian ideas and encouraging literacy. James Shepherd devoted himself to translating portions of scripture into the local language so that instruction could proceed in familiar words, rather than foreign ones. Visitors arriving at Kerikeri were often struck by the transformation taking place. One described the station as resembling a tidy English hamlet. Cattle, sheep, goats and pigs grazed beside fields of wheat and barley. Gardens overflowed with vegetables and fruit trees unknown in the islands a decade earlier. Geese and ducks wandered through the yards, and in the evenings cows returned to be milked, providing butter for the households. To travellers accustomed to the wild coast, the scene appeared almost unreal. Such progress depended on food security. To reduce reliance on Maori supplies, Marsden shipped cattle across the Tasman. By the end of 1823, the herd had grown to about 50 head, and he formally presented them to the Society. Their management was entrusted to Davis, who struggled to balance agricultural work with the demands of daily mission life. Butler estimated that when he left Kerikeri, roughly 50 Maori, mostly those employed by the settlers, could read a little, sing hymns, and repeat prayers in their own tongue. Cultivation had advanced so far that the problem was no longer scarcity of grain, but the labour required to grind it. The hand mill exhausted the workers and discouraged further planting, so Marsden planned to build a water-driven mill and arranged for stones to be sent from England. Shepherd continued his linguistic work, preparing a vocabulary, hymns, and a small tract describing creation and redemption. During this same year, Kendall and Butler severed their connection with the Society, a decision that marked the end of an early chapter. At Rangihua, observers also noticed change. Villagers who had once viewed the strangers with suspicion were slowly adopting new habits. Marsden wrote with relief that the settlers lived as peacefully as in any European country and experienced little trouble from their neighbours. A new school opened, and children gathered daily to learn letters and numbers. They were clothed and fed by the mission, attended church each Sunday, and appeared eager for instruction. Hall, an able craftsman, earned respect from visiting sailors by repairing damaged ships and offering hospitality to officers. Another figure soon joined the enterprise. Francis Hall, who served as secretary and storekeeper, decided to return to England at the end of 1822. His character was praised as exemplary, and he had shown particular concern for Maori health, urging that medical help be provided as native resistance to European remedies gradually weakened. The next major arrival was Henry Williams with his family. They sailed from England in 1822, endured a long voyage by way of Rio and Van Diemen's Land, and reached Port Jackson early in 1823. After several months, they crossed to New Zealand aboard the Bampton, accompanied by Marsden and a small party that included Methodist workers. The original plan had been for Williams to settle at Whangaroa, but as the Wesleyans were already established there, Marsden chose a new site at Paihia, on the southern side of the Bay of Islands. The location proved beautiful and practical. A stretch of level ground near the beach offered room for crops and buildings. Williams later described the difficulties of landing stores in relentless wind and rain, yet the Maori assisted willingly, expecting small gifts in return. The settlers ate and prayed in the open among the villagers, who watched every movement with curiosity but showed little desire to steal. A chief declared one hut sacred for European use, and no one dared even to look inside it. Within days, the newcomers had a rough house of reeds, 40 feet long, with several small rooms. Mrs. Williams arrived to find a scene both daunting and strangely welcoming. Fields of young oats and barley beside a clear beach, a hive-shaped dwelling, goats and poultry wandering about, and saw pits where timber was being prepared. On the first Sunday, a simple chapel was opened, the Union Jack raised, and the bell rang across the water as Maori carried planks to serve as benches. Henry Williams, formerly a naval officer, had entered the ministry only the year before sailing. His practical training and steady temperament soon made him a central figure in northern New Zealand. The events that followed would show how profoundly the mission landscape was changing, from scattered huts dependent on uncertain trade to organised communities, with schools, farms, and a growing confidence that a different kind of society might be possible on these distant shores. The agreement for the land at Whangaroa was sealed in a manner that reflected the meeting of two very different worlds. The chiefs, unable to sign their names in the European fashion, pressed the familiar patterns of their facial tattoos onto the prepared paper, transferring the identity of their tribes to a foreign document. To the missionaries, this gesture carried the weight of a binding contract. To the Maori, it was a ceremonial confirmation that the strangers were now guests under their protection. Only a few days later, the small community was shaken by unexpected events. On the 19th of August, Mr. and Mrs. Lee, accompanied by Samuel Marsden, left Whangaroa intending to sail to New South Wales aboard the brig Brampton. Their departure seemed straightforward, yet the sea quickly intervened. As the vessel attempted to leave the Bay of Islands, heavy weather drove her onto the rocks. The wreck forced the travellers to wait for another opportunity, and not until November, when the ship Dragon arrived from Tahiti, were they able to continue to Sydney. One of their colleagues, Mr. White, remained behind in New Zealand and returned to the Whangaroa station the following February. Accounts of the loss of the Brampton varied widely. Some later stories exaggerated the drama, but Marsden's own description offers a clearer picture. The brig had weighed anchor on a threatening Sunday morning with an easterly gale blowing straight into the harbour mouth. Lightly loaded and riding high, she failed to answer her helm while beating along the rocky lee shore. Soundings showed dangerously shallow water, and with reefs close to leeward, the captain ordered the anchor dropped. When the tide turned, the ship struck repeatedly, the sea rising with every hour. Fearing for the safety of the sick Lees, Marsden asked for a boat to carry them to a nearby island. Māori from the coast showed immediate concern, lighting a fire and preparing a reed hut for the exhausted couple. Messengers were sent to the mission station at Rangihua, requesting assistance and a large canoe. At first the islanders hesitated, insisting that the waves would smash any craft, but persistence overcame their doubts. By mid-afternoon, help arrived from the Bay of Islands. Mission boats and a war canoe battled through the surf and reached the stranded vessel. Night fell before they returned, and those waiting on the island lay awake, listening to the storm, uncertain whether friends or passengers had survived. At dawn, the brig was still upright, though driven closer to the shore. No boats appeared, and anxiety deepened until Mr. Hall came with news that the bottom of the ship was broken out, but that lives were not in immediate danger. The passengers, he said, hoped to wait for calmer weather. Over the next days, the gale intensified. The mainmast was cut away, and the natives on board cried out as it crashed into the sea. Eventually, the missionaries at Kerikeri learned of the disaster and dispatched further boats. Women and children were taken ashore, and most of the cargo was salvaged. The episode revealed how dependent the Europeans were on local goodwill. Marsden later reflected that without the confidence already built by years of contact, both people and property would have been entirely at Maori mercy. The missionary enterprise at this time was undergoing its own trials. Reports reached England that 2 members had been dismissed for behaviour unworthy of their calling. Marsden admitted that some early settlers had proved unreliable and had required constant discipline. Nevertheless, the work continued. At Rangihua and Kerikeri, cattle herds were growing, schools were operating, and several dozen Maori could already read simple texts and join in hymns. At Whangaroa, the situation was less settled. The Methodist station there had been established only recently, and the staff were strangers to local language and custom. Misunderstandings multiplied. The law of tapu, which governed every aspect of Maori life, baffled the newcomers. On one occasion, a boiler used to wash the clothes of a chief's son was declared sacred and claimed as property. A tense struggle followed before the vessel was restored and ritually cleansed. Such incidents, though minor in European eyes, touched deep spiritual boundaries for the local people. Encounters with visiting ships also brought trouble. The Endeavour, a London mission vessel, sought shelter in the harbour during 1824. While bartering on board, a quarrel between the captain and a chief erupted, and for a time the crew feared for their lives. The missionaries who arrived in a small boat were able to calm the situation, yet the event left lingering resentment. Later that year, the whaling brig Mercury ran aground after a dispute over trade, and the crew fled while Maori stripped the vessel of movable goods. Mission workers attempted to save the ship, but without charts or instruments they were forced to abandon her and retreat along the coast. Tensions at the station reached a peak in March 1825. A disagreement over a stolen dog escalated into violence. One chief threatened the missionaries with a spear, and blows were exchanged before others intervened. The episode convinced many of the Europeans that their position was precarious. They feared retaliation from neighbouring tribes, possible punishment by British authorities for the seizure of the Mercury, and the death of a local protector who had warned that his people might demand vengeance if he died. Meeting at Kerikeri with colleagues from the church mission, the Whangaroa staff listed their concerns. The temper of the local inhabitants, the recent conflicts with ships, and the uncertainty of future reprisals all seemed to argue for withdrawal. They worried that remaining might endanger the larger mission at the Bay of Islands, and believed that the fragile settlement could not withstand another crisis. By the middle of March, the situation at Whangaroa had become so tense that Mrs. Turner and the children were quietly escorted overland to the Kerikeri mission. They remained there for more than 3 months, a period that revealed how closely the 2 stations depended on one another. Movement between the Bay of Islands and Whangaroa had previously been frequent and almost casual, yet now every journey carried an undertone of anxiety. The women left Wensleydale without ceremony, a gesture the Maori easily understood as a sign of impending departure. According to local custom, such an intention could have justified the immediate seizure of all mission property. But Hongi had issued strict orders forbidding any harm to the Europeans. Some chiefs openly expressed their unease. One admitted that his heart felt heavy at the thought that the strangers might leave and carry away everything they owned. Between the lines of these exchanges, it became clear that many Maori did not believe the missionaries had sufficient reason to abandon their post. The church mission at Te Puna had faced equal or greater difficulties and had endured them. Hongi himself demonstrated unexpected goodwill, ordering the construction of a large canoe for the possible transport of the mission families, while Te Puhi, the protector of the station, was said to have wept when he learned that the settlement might be deserted. At the end of March, a striking ceremony took place near the village. Numerous remains of the dead were brought from their resting places, the skulls carefully arranged and anointed with oil, then decorated with feathers. To the missionaries, this spectacle was disturbing, yet it formed an essential part of Maori remembrance. One of the Europeans attempted to speak to the gathered crowd about resurrection, but the listeners regarded the words as distant and incomprehensible. During the first week of April, uncertainty deepened. Several boatloads of goods were quietly moved to Kerikeri in case of disaster. Some members of the mission returned to the bay to consult colleagues, while others stayed behind to watch events. Reports circulated that Hongi was preparing a new campaign against the Ngatipo people at the harbour mouth. The men of the local tribe were summoned to join him, and within hours most able-bodied inhabitants embarked in canoes, leaving the missionaries almost alone. Before departing, the villagers warned that roaming bands might soon arrive to plunder the deserted place. The warning proved accurate. On the 10th of January at dawn, a small armed group from Hongi's own tribe climbed over the mission fence and declared that the station was now unprotected and therefore open to seizure. Outbuildings were forced, pigs driven off, and tools and stores carried away. The missionaries retreated to their dwelling, realizing that resistance was impossible. By mid-morning, the main house itself was being broken into and stripped room by room. With little more than the clothes they wore and a few bundles, the Europeans decided to flee toward Kerikeri, accompanied by several Maori youths who had lived under their care. Their escape became a nervous journey through fields and forest. Fog lay over the ground, and the women were soaked by dew as they crossed the maize plots. Twice the party waded through the winding river. At a bend in the track, they encountered messengers from Hokianga urging them to hide, for a large war party was advancing. Fearful, but determined, they pressed on until the column of armed men suddenly appeared around a corner. The missionaries were ordered to sit, while the chiefs conferred. After a tense pause, the leader, Patuone, greeted them with gestures of friendship and commanded his warriors to march past without touching the fugitives. An elderly chief escorted the group for several miles until they reached safer territory. Toward evening, friends from the Bay of Islands met them with refreshments and makeshift chairs to carry the exhausted women. By sunset, the refugees arrived at Kerikeri, where they were received with sympathy by the church missionaries. Local leaders soon advised that remaining there might provoke further retaliation and urged the families to move to Paihia until a clearer decision could be made. News from Whangaroa in the following days confirmed the worst fears. After the first plunderers had been driven away by a rival group from Hokianga, the second party helped itself to what remained. The mission buildings were burned, a barn of newly harvested wheat destroyed, and the small herd of cattle slaughtered. Even the grave of an infant was disturbed in the search for valuables. The station that had represented years of effort disappeared in a single morning. Responsibility for the disaster was debated from many sides. Hongi denied ordering any attack and claimed that the marauders were unauthorized followers. He insisted that he had commanded protection for the missionaries and that, on discovering the looted canoes, he had punished some of the offenders. Others believed the flight of Te Puhi and his family had encouraged opportunists who regarded the settlement as abandoned property. Whatever the truth, the destruction convinced the Methodist workers that their position at Whangaroa was no longer tenable. Gradually, the scattered families were reunited at Paihia. Life there continued under the shelter of the larger mission, while plans were made for departure to New South Wales. On the 21st of January, 1827, the remaining members of the Whangaroa mission sailed from New Zealand, ending an experiment that had begun with hope and closed amid confusion and misunderstanding. The episode revealed more than the vulnerability of a single station. It exposed the fragile nature of early cross-cultural contact, where unfamiliar laws, clashing expectations, and the turbulence of intertribal warfare could overturn years of patient labour. To some observers, the failure proved the impossibility of peaceful change. To others, it was a lesson in how little either side yet understood the other. The burned buildings at Wesley Dale became a silent reminder that goodwill alone could not bridge the distance between two worlds, still learning how to meet. In May of 1822, a merchant vessel named Providence appeared in the Bay of Islands, under the command of Captain James Hurd. After only a brief stay, the ship sailed westward toward the Hokianga River, where reports spoke of tall kauri trees suitable for naval masts. The Providence crossed the bar on a quiet Sunday and anchored within the broad estuary, remaining there for 4 months while the crew worked with local Māori to gather timber. By the end of June, the decks were crowded with enormous spars, some stretching more than 70 feet in length. Yet the captain soon realised that many of the finest trunks had been cut too short, reducing their value in the British market. He began to consider selling the load in Sydney and returning for a more carefully selected cargo. Relations between the sailors and the inhabitants were unusually cordial. The Maori felled the trees, hauled them to the water and delivered them alongside the vessel with remarkable efficiency. No serious quarrels or thefts were recorded, and the ship entered and left the river without mishap. 2 European residents, John Cowell and Thomas Kendall, acted as mediators and interpreters, helping to maintain trust on both sides. During the visit, Captain Hurd surveyed the winding river and its dangerous bar, preparing a chart that would guide later navigators. The commander returned to these coasts several years later with a more ambitious purpose. In Britain, a group of merchants and politicians had formed a company to establish a permanent settlement in New Zealand. They equipped the bark, Rosanna, and sent with her a party of tradesmen, shipwrights, sawyers, blacksmiths, and flax workers, together with machines for sawing timber and preparing fibre. A smaller cutter, the Lambton, sailed in company. The plan was to secure land, build a factory for processing local resources, and open a regular trade with Europe. At first, the project enjoyed official encouragement. Ministers in London spoke favourably of the scheme, and there were even suggestions that a charter might be granted once the preliminary expedition proved successful. But from the beginning, the enterprise rested on uncertain foundations. New Zealand lay outside formal British authority, and rumours circulated that other European powers might claim interest in the islands. These diplomatic hesitations, combined with the sheer distance and expense, placed a heavy burden on the promoters. When the Rosanna reached the Hauraki Gulf in 1826, the settlers hoped to choose a site near the Thames. Some reports later claimed that they were frightened away by a Maori welcome ceremony, misinterpreted as a threat. Whatever the precise cause, the leaders decided not to land there and move northward to Hokianga. At a place known later as Herd's Point, they negotiated the purchase of a tract of land from local chiefs. The agreement was respected by many in the district, yet doubts remained about its extent and legality. Life on board the Rosanna soon became uneasy. The vessel carried a large store of gunpowder intended for trade, and the presence of such a prize aroused dangerous interest. The crew maintained a constant watch as if at sea, allowing only a few trusted chiefs to visit the deck. Missionaries at the Bay of Islands warned the captain of plots to seize the ship, and these alerts persuaded him that the settlement could not be safely established. After nearly a year of uncertainty, the company abandoned its design. The mechanics and artisans were offered passage back to Britain, and the equipment brought for the new colony was sold in Sydney. Newspapers mocked the failure, describing the venture as grand in conception but impossible in practice without government support. The Rosanna herself required repairs and was later chartered for the homeward voyage. Yet Captain Heard's observations left an enduring impression. He spoke of the populous communities along the Hokianga and of witnessing thousands of warriors armed with muskets and cartridge boxes. The sight revealed how deeply European trade had already altered the balance of power among the tribes. A few former employees chose to remain in New Zealand, believing that opportunities would still arise despite the collapse of the organised plan. A very different figure entered New Zealand's story through the adventures of John Rutherford. According to his own account, he spent a decade among Māori after being captured on the east coast. Born in Manchester near the end of the 18th century, he had gone to sea as a child and roamed the world in naval and trading vessels. Service in Brazil, participation in the storming of San Sebastian, voyages to India and China and wanderings among Pacific islands filled his early years. Eventually he joined an American brig engaged in the pearl trade, and in 1816 the ship approached the eastern shores of New Zealand, seeking supplies. Storms drove the vessel south of its intended destination, and after 5 days of heavy weather, the captain reluctantly entered an unfamiliar bay. Canoes crowded around, most paddled by women eager to trade mats and fishing lines made from strong native flax. Their friendliness concealed restless curiosity, and that night, many small items vanished from the deck. The following morning, a prominent chief arrived in a great war canoe and arranged to bring fresh water from the shore. For a time, relations seemed peaceful, and pigs and fern root were exchanged in abundance. Suspicion grew when ropes were found cut and nails pulled from the ship's boat. Smoke signals appeared on the hills, and the captain prepared to sail. As the crew went below for a hurried meal, the Maori suddenly cast aside their cloaks and began a fierce chant. In the confusion, the captain was struck down with a tomahawk, and the cook and mate were killed in moments. The rest of the sailors were overwhelmed and bound, while the ship drifted toward the bar and was plundered. At sunset, the prisoners were carried to a village, their dead companions thrown beside them in the canoe. During the night, great fires blazed on the beach as canoes ferried spoil from the wreck. At dawn, the hull was burning near the river mouth. The captives were brought before an assembly of chiefs, and after long debate, 6 were executed with chilling laughter from the crowd. The bodies were prepared in earth ovens, a sight that filled the survivors with terror. Rutherford and 5 others were spared and led inland through forest and swamp to the home of a chief named Rangari, where mourning ceremonies greeted their arrival. In the days that followed, the prisoners were distributed among different leaders. Rutherford eventually reached the settlement of Amy, a powerful chief, and there his life took a strange turn. The newcomers were stripped and subjected to the painful process of tattooing, which marked them as taboo and temporarily sacred. For several days they were fed by the chief's daughters from the same baskets as their elders, and slowly the swelling of the wounds subsided. Months passed in hunting and fishing. Rutherford borrowed the chief's fowling piece and supplied pigeons for the household. Then a misfortune altered everything. An elderly woman of the village fell ill and died after eating food prepared with a knife that had touched common materials. The doctor accused one of the Europeans of causing the death, and despite desperate pleas, the man was struck down before the assembly. The victim was buried according to Christian custom, but the incident taught Rutherford how fragile his safety remained. From that time he lived alone among the tribe, adopting their clothing and customs. His European garments wore out, leaving only a flax mat for covering. The village life continued with its rhythms of planting, fishing, feasting, and war. He watched the elaborate rites surrounding the exhumation of the old woman's bones, which were cleaned, placed in a carved box, and set within a sacred enclosure guarded by a wooden image. Such honours were reserved for chiefs, while slaves were buried without ceremony. Years drifted by with little change. Rutherford learned the language and became familiar with the landscape, yet he never forgot the sudden violence that had brought him there. Every gathering of warriors, every dispute over trade, reminded him that survival depended on the goodwill of those around him. The story of his captivity, later carried back to Europe, offered outsiders a rare glimpse into a society both hospitable and uncompromising, where generosity and cruelty could stand side by side and where the laws of honour shaped every human bond. One day, during a feast in the settlement, the local leader, Amy, summoned the outsider in front of several influential chiefs. He spoke of the man's skill in hunting, fishing, and handling himself in the bush, then announced that he intended to raise him to the rank of chief if he would accept. The offer was taken without hesitation. At once, a ceremonial change began. The man's hair was cut at the front with a sharp oyster shell, in the distinctive style worn by chiefs, and gifts followed as a sign that the decision had weight. Mats were placed into his hands, and promises were made that pigs would be sent the next day. He was dressed in a finely prepared mat, stained with red earth and oiled until it shone, the same kind worn by the other leading men. A young woman, a chief's daughter who had never met him before, rubbed the same mixture over his head and face as if sealing the transformation in public view. A handsome stone club was presented as well, and from that day forward he kept it with him as a constant emblem of his new standing. After the ceremony, Amy spoke again and urged him to take wives, explaining that chiefs were expected to have more than one if they wished. The new chief agreed to take 2. A large group of women, said to be around 60, were brought forward for him to choose from. Yet he refused them all, unimpressed and unwilling to decide quickly. Amy responded by placing a restriction on him for 3 days, declaring him under a taboo that limited his actions until the time had passed. When the 3 days ended, Amy led him to a related camp, promising that there he would see women more to his liking. At that camp, another group was brought forward. Instead of selecting from those presented, his attention fixed on Amy's 2 daughters, who had followed and were sitting quietly on the grass. He walked directly to the elder and stated that he would choose her. Her reaction was immediate. She screamed and ran. 2 men threw off their outer mats to chase her, caught her quickly, and brought her back. Under Amy's direction, the new chief took her hand. Only then did the men release her. She walked with him toward her father, head lowered, laughing in a way that suggested embarrassment as much as acceptance. Amy then called the younger daughter, who approached laughing as well, and he advised that both should be taken. The man asked them plainly whether they were willing to go with him. And they replied with a phrase that carried the sense of agreement, though with a faint shade of hesitation, as if saying they supposed they would. Amy declared that they now belonged to him under taboo, and the 3 returned together to the village, followed by a crowd curious to witness the outcome. Not long after, Amy and his brother arrived, and that evening a great feast was held for the people. Much of the night was filled with a dance performed mainly on special occasions when large gatherings came together. The women stood in a line and moved as one body, while several held muskets above their heads as part of the display. Men provided the vocal rhythm, singing in support of the dancers, because there were no musical instruments used to accompany such ceremonies. The two wives were named Hau and Pekka. They were described as attractive, calm, and good-natured. Certain household customs quickly became unavoidable. The man was expected to eat with them outside, because they would not eat beneath the roof of his house, which their tradition forbade. When he travelled for longer periods, he often took Pekka with him and left Hau behind. Jealousy between chiefs' wives was not treated as normal. Harmony was expected, with the elder wife regarded as the senior within the household. Marriage itself required little beyond what had already been done. Social rules around rank remained strict. A child born to a slave woman inherited the mother's status even if the father was a chief. Adultery, if discovered and judged, could lead to immediate execution. Some chiefs took wives from among enslaved women, yet ordinary men who did the same placed themselves at risk because they could be robbed without consequence. By contrast, marrying into a chief's family offered a kind of protection, since few dared steal from those linked to high status. Property disputes were handled in ways that made theft both common and strangely regulated. If a stolen object remained hidden for 3 days, it was widely treated as belonging to the thief, and the injured person's only real remedy was retaliation through theft in return. If the item was found before the 3 days passed, it had to be returned, but even then the thief was often not punished. Chiefs were safe from the petty theft of their inferiors, but not from one another. Leading men plundered rivals, and those insults could easily escalate into war. At one point, the new chief travelled with Amy on a long journey that took weeks. He brought Pekka with him. They were accompanied by around 20 enslaved women who carried supplies and managed livestock along the way. Each woman bore a heavy load of potatoes for the group, often said to be around 30 pounds beyond what she needed for herself, while also driving a pig forward, held by a cord tied to its leg. Men did not travel unarmed. The route alternated between water and land. After about a month, they reached a coastal settlement called Taranaki near Cook Strait, where they were received by a powerful leader named Otako, who had travelled from the far south. Greetings followed local etiquette. Noses touched in greeting, and tears were shed as part of the formal welcome, a display that could be sincere, strategic, or both. In that place, the traveller met an Englishman named James Māori. Maori's story carried the harsh pattern of early contact. He had once belonged to a ship's crew sent ashore to trade, and the party was attacked. Everyone was killed except him, spared because he was young and because Otako's daughter protected him. He later married that woman, lived for years among the people, learned the language, and joined them in war. He had become so accustomed to the life that he intended never to leave. Those who met him noted that he had forgotten much of his own language, and he was heavily tattooed, no longer carrying himself like a newcomer. He spoke of earlier killings and the fate of shipmates, and in exchange he listened to the captive's account of how he had survived. The traveller remained at Taranaki for about 6 weeks and watched the strait constantly, hoping for a passing ship that might offer escape. None appeared. He kept his plan secret, even from the other Englishmen, because loyalty had shifted. A man deeply tied to local life could become a danger to anyone plotting to leave. The journey continued along the coast. After another long march, the party reached East Cape and encountered a feared war leader named Pomare, associated with the Bay of Islands. Pomara's force was large, with war canoes, muskets with polished barrels, powder stored in small kegs, and supplies of potatoes and flax mats. His reputation came from violence on a wide scale. He displayed preserved heads of chiefs he had killed and spoke openly of carrying them north to trade with visiting ships for gunpowder. After the group separated, the travellers moved on, camping in the woods at night, sleeping near large fires under trees, and returning home exhausted. Howe welcomed the traveller back with visible relief. Life remained quiet for a time, until news arrived that chiefs across the region were preparing for a major expedition. The destination was Kaipara, near the source of the Thames River, far away by local standards. Allies were expected, enemies anticipated, and preparations began immediately. Women were set to work making new baskets for provisions. Each person on such a campaign was expected to provide weapons, ammunition, food, and enslaved carriers. Plunder was taken individually. Gifts to the chief were given at each warrior's discretion. Slaves were not required to fight, though they sometimes ran forward to assist their masters in moments of danger. When the departure day came, the new chief marched with the others carrying his stone club, pistols, and a double-barreled gun, along with powder, balls, and abundant shot for hunting along the route. Pekka travelled with him and carried mats intended to serve as bedding, woven during his earlier absence. The expedition was large, said to be around 500 including warriors and carriers, though many carriers were sent home once supplies were consumed. The march took place in rainy season, making it especially punishing. Friendly villages offered shelter at night, otherwise the party slept in forest camps. When provisions ran out, they took what they could wherever they found it. After 5 weeks they reached Kaipara and found a much larger encampment already there, perhaps more than 1,000 men beside a river. Huts were built quickly, and a hut was assigned to the traveller and Pekka. They were provided 2 enslaved women to gather fern root, collect shellfish, and catch fish, which became their main food except when hunting produced birds or wild pigs. Across the river, shallow enough to wade at points, an opposing force waited for reinforcements. Messengers crossed constantly. One messenger announced that a white man in the enemy camp had heard of the traveller and wished to see him. Permission was offered for a safe meeting if the traveller crossed unarmed and returned when he wanted. With Amy's approval, he crossed alone, leaving his weapons and even leaving Pekka behind. On the far side, he was greeted in the same way as before by the pressing together of noses, and he was seated among chiefs, beside the other European, who introduced himself as John Mormon. Mormon claimed he had fled a warship and then joined local life, marrying a chief's daughter and living under the protection of her family. He spoke of recent news from the Bay of Islands, of missionaries and of ships taken or attacked along the coast, including places infamous for earlier massacres. During this visit, a brutal scene unfolded. A slave was brought before a chief. The chief rose, struck the man down with a club, and killed him on the spot. The weapon was unusual, described as steel rather than stone. The chief then tore out the victim's heart and ate it immediately. The bystanders explained that this chief was Hongi, a man who had visited England and received gifts from high-ranking patrons, including firearms and armour, which he later wore in battles. His reason for killing the slave was given as punishment for theft. The slave had stolen the armour and tried to flee to the enemy. The traveller claimed this was the only theft he ever saw punished in that land. He also judged Hongi as ferocious, despite his exposure to Europeans, and suggested that Hongi protected missionaries mainly for the advantage he could gain from them. Soon after, the enemy camp withdrew from the river. Both sides prepared to fight. Muskets were widespread, purchased through trade with visiting English and American ships. The the two armies crossed the river and took positions. The traveller stood on a rise with a clear view and was not required to join the main line, though he remained armed and alert. Behind him sat Pika and the two enslaved women. Each side's commander stepped forward, began a war chant, and after it, both groups performed a war dance, shouting and swinging weapons, building themselves into a frenzy. Then the lines formed two deep, with women and boys positioned behind, close enough to retrieve weapons and assist. The musket volleys came first. Many did not shoulder their guns, firing from the hip or holding them awkwardly, then discarding them behind as if the musket were only a single-use opening strike. Women and boys gathered the dropped guns as the warriors drew clubs and axes and rushed together. Close combat turned savage and fast. Fighters grabbed hair with one hand and struck with the other, severing heads as trophies, while the screams from behind rose into a frightening chorus. Those supporting the fighters received heads as soon as they were taken. Warriors then moved among the fallen to seize bodies, sometimes ending with mismatched heads and corpses, trophies separated from the men they belonged to. The fight lasted only minutes before one side broke and fled into the woods. In the chaos, a fleeing man crossed the hill where the traveller stood and threw a jagged spear that lodged deep in his thigh. Two women later cut it out using an oyster shell. The wound was described as wide and severe. He was carried back across the river on a woman's back, and Peka applied crushed green herbs that stopped the bleeding and dulled the pain. The victors returned with prisoners, who became slaves to whoever seized them. The body of a chief killed in the fight was brought back and laid on mats in front of the huts. Heads were mounted on long spears and raised around the camp. Bodies were carried to fires to be cooked according to local custom. Through the night, the camp celebrated with dancing and chanting. The next morning, a feast was held that included both fern root and human flesh, presented as a victory rite. The slain chief's body was cut into pieces, packed into baskets, covered with dark mats, and loaded into canoes. Other casualties were named on both sides, and trophies were kept and preserved. Afterward, the war party travelled downriver by canoe to a place called Hauraki, where a relative of the dead lived. As the canoes approached, the group sang a funeral chant. Hills were crowded with women and children, faces painted red, heads decorated with white feathers, waving mats and calling out a welcome. Once ashore, the warriors performed a naked dance, then staged a mock battle with another group of warriors, as if turning violence into theatre and theatre into ritual. Baskets containing body parts were opened publicly. A head was decorated with feathers and placed atop one basket, while other captured heads were displayed on spears throughout the village. The mother of the slain stood on the roof dressed in feathers, turning and crying, twisting her hands in grief that was both personal and communal. The land around that settlement was described as unusually fertile and well cultivated compared with other areas. Yet even there, horror was not absent. Incidents were reported of women consuming parts of their own infants after a child had been killed by a master. Details presented as evidence of how far violence could reach into domestic life. Not long after returning home, a sudden alarm spread through the village. Smoke rose from distant high ground, and people ran shouting that a ship had appeared on the coast. For the captive, this news brought a surge of hope. Amy and others gathered warriors and enslaved carriers, loaded with trade goods like mats and potatoes, driving pigs ahead, and hurried toward the shore. They reached Tokomaro after 2 days, a place tied to earlier disaster for the captive and his crew. The ship was visible but held offshore by strong winds. That night they camped and ate, and the captive noticed some still wore trinkets, taken long ago from the captured vessel. A grim gift arrived during the meal, a basket said to contain cooked flesh, from a recently killed slave girl. When it was opened, it resembled roasted pork. The captive handed it away, and the chiefs shared it. As the leaders talked, their plan hardened. If the ship came closer, they intended to seize it and kill the crew. They decided the captive should go aboard first to lure the ship in. He agreed outwardly, but his purpose was different. He was dressed in prestige clothing of feathers and armed with a finely carved stone axe, head described as green glass in appearance and extremely hard. In a canoe he approached the vessel, which turned out to be an American brig under Captain Jackson, trading among Pacific islands and heading for the California coast. The captain stared at the tattooed man and exclaimed that a white New Zealander had come aboard. The captive corrected him and revealed he was English. In the cabin, he told his story and warned of the danger of landing. He begged the captain to turn away quickly and take him, because this was the only real chance he had seen in years. Meanwhile, one of the chief's sons began stealing aboard. The crew tied him up, flogged him, and threw him back into the canoe. The captain was ready to punish the others as well, but the captive intervened, worried that those ashore might retaliate against any remaining survivors from earlier shipwrecks. Captain Jackson agreed to carry him away. The canoe was set adrift, and the brig stood out to sea. Only then did the captive learn the date, 9th of January 1826. By his reckoning, he had been held for almost 10 years. On the ship he received clothing and basic necessities. In return he gave the captain the local garments and weapon that had marked his adopted status. The voyage carried him onward through the Pacific, eventually reaching Tahiti in February. There he entered service under British authority and worked at hard labour, cutting and sawing wood. Later he married a local woman of rank, and for a time he acted as an interpreter for naval officers surveying the region. Yet the pull of home remained. He sailed again in early January 1827 toward Port Jackson, promising those he left behind that he would return within 2 years if possible. From Port Jackson he moved through other ports and ships, eventually reaching Europe. In South America, a man of means took interest in his story and arranged for him to be questioned by an emperor through an interpreter, who then gave him money and offered naval employment. He refused, choosing instead a passage back to England. At last, he returned to Manchester, the city of his birth, which he had not seen since he first went to sea as a teenager. After his return, survival demanded humiliations. At times, he joined travelling exhibitions, displaying his tattoos and recounting his experiences. Observers described him as quick-minded and sharply attentive to detail. He was said to dislike being exhibited, but endured it to raise enough money to return to the Pacific, where he believed he could live more freely than in the tight routines of England. He claimed he would not fear returning to New Zealand, confident that former companions would accept that he had been carried away by force, not by betrayal. With knowledge of local customs and with skilled tradesmen and iron, he believed trade could be turned into a profitable enterprise. While such personal stories spread through ports and taverns, another force was tightening its grip along the coasts, the missionaries. The growing flow of visiting ships had brought disorder, and leaders in the mission feared that uncontrolled trade encouraged idleness, petty bargaining, greed, and endless distraction from religious work. Rules were laid down to limit private deals and prevent mission workers from trading for personal gain. Purchases from visiting ships were to be approved by a local committee, with designated representatives handling negotiations to reduce suspicion and jealousy. Timber was not to be supplied without approval, and any proceeds were to be recorded for the mission rather than pocketed by individuals. Every transaction was to be written down in a public record to guard against accusations and internal corruption. Those who broke the rules were to be reported and could be suspended or dismissed. The mission itself shifted as people came and went. Some workers returned to New South Wales or England, and new settlers arrived with practical skills. A gunsmith was valued not only for mission work, but also because local war leaders expected their firearms to be repaired and improved. Others arrived as carpenters or farmers. Settlements were organised across different sites, with small chapels and schools. Services were held, sermons read, and efforts made to teach reading in the hope that scriptures could eventually be understood in the local language. Attendance was uneven. Promises to send children often dissolved into reluctance once the school opened. Still, some boys and girls, including children of chiefs, were taught and supported. The mission families tried to model a disciplined routine: worship, morning and evening, instruction whenever possible, and practical aid for the sick in the form of food, tea, and bread. Farming became part of the effort, with wheat planted and harvested to feed mission households. Cattle were kept, some wandering wild, and chiefs asked for breeding pairs to spread livestock across the country. Yet despite these plans, shipping remained a constant disturbance. Runaway sailors and deserters clustered around the Bay of Islands, some living by plunder, and captains sometimes hired these men when short of crew, feeding a cycle of lawlessness. At Paihia, the situation at the beginning of the year appeared uncertain and heavy with anxiety. News had arrived that a vessel from Port Jackson, the brig Mercury, had been seized at Whangaroa, and the effect of this act spread quickly through the Bay of Islands. Traders grew cautious, visiting ships became suspicious, and the local population, already sensitive to rumour, drifted into a restless and threatening mood. At the same time, food was scarce. Potatoes and pork, the staples on which both settlers and many Māori families relied, were difficult to obtain, and there were days when even the mission households wondered how the next week would be managed. Yet as the months passed, a small but significant change began to take shape among the people. The change centred on an elderly chief named Rangi, and his story gradually came to symbolise a new direction. The roots of the episode lay further to the south. After the destructive campaigns led by Hongi along the Thames River, the communities of Bream Bay found themselves in a dangerous position. They were allies of the northern leaders, yet their lands lay close to tribes that had been attacked and humiliated. Fearing retaliation, many families abandoned their homes and sought shelter at the Bay of Islands. Rangi was among these refugees. Though not the highest-ranking man of his people, he carried authority and experience, and he settled with his followers about a mile from the mission station at Paihia. From the beginning, he showed an unusual curiosity about the teaching offered by the Europeans. While most of his companions listened politely but without commitment, the old chief attended repeatedly, asking questions and reflecting on what he heard. This was in 1824, a time when the missionaries themselves felt they were speaking into an empty wind. Rangi, however, began to urge his neighbours to treat the seventh day differently from the others. He devised a simple signal. On the morning he believed to be the day of rest, he hoisted a piece of red cloth as a flag, so that everyone around would know it was not a day for ordinary labour. Little by little, he abandoned the rituals of his earlier life and declared himself willing to follow the new faith. When he was eventually baptized, he became the first person of the local people to make such a public commitment. Those who watched the ceremony sensed that something more than a private decision had taken place. By September, the mood around Paihia had softened. The missionaries noted that they were now received with courtesy almost everywhere they travelled, and that open hostility had given way to a cautious respect. At the same time, practical needs pressed heavily. A small vessel had been ordered to assist the mission in moving food and visiting scattered settlements. The lack of such a craft had been keenly felt, for provisions were often trapped in one district while another faced hunger. When work began on the boat, the settlement nearly ran out of supplies. For a period there was no pork at all, and the last store of potatoes was boiled and eaten with uncertainty about what would follow. Without help from the sea, some feared they might be forced to live on fern root like the poorest families around them. The building of the vessel brought a new figure onto the stage. Gilbert Mair, a young man from Scotland who had reached the Bay of Islands after several adventurous voyages, joined the project. He possessed energy, practical skill, and a bold temperament suited to the unsettled frontier. The schooner, later named the Herald, was the first craft of its kind constructed in northern New Zealand, and the work attracted attention far beyond the mission. Not all of that attention was friendly. A group of Māori, angered by some imagined grievance, gathered around the partly finished hull and threatened to burn it and destroy those responsible. In the confrontation that followed, the missionaries and Mair defended themselves vigorously, with whatever tools lay at hand. The crowd eventually scattered, but not before Mair suffered a broken arm, a reminder that progress in those years rarely came without risk. When the Herald was finally launched in January 1826, the event became a spectacle. Thousands of Maori gathered from surrounding districts, expecting that the heavy labour of moving the vessel would bring rich payment. They imagined teams of men hauling with ropes in the traditional manner used for canoes. Instead, the builders had prepared a proper slipway. At the moment chosen, the dogshores were knocked aside and the schooner slid smoothly into the water. The onlookers, astonished, burst into cries of amazement. Their carefully calculated demands vanished, replaced by wonder, at a method that required neither strength nor payment. The Herald soon proved her worth. Under Mair's command, she carried missionaries to Sydney, brought back stores, and linked distant harbours along the coast. On her first voyage across the Tasman, several Māori formed part of the crew, learning the disciplines of the sea. The little ship also served another purpose. It allowed the mission to rescue threatened people. When rumours spread that a party from the bay intended to attack visitors sheltering at Paihia, the Herald slipped away at night and landed them safely at their own territory in the Bay of Plenty. Meanwhile, life at the various stations continued with mixed success. At Rangihua and Kerikeri, small schools struggled to keep regular attendance. Children learned to read and write in their own language, though the lack of printed books limited progress. Some parents were proud to hear their sons read passages aloud, yet many families drifted away whenever seasonal work or warfare intervened. The missionaries spent long hours translating portions of scripture, checking every word with those who knew the language best, hoping that one day printed texts would replace the fragile manuscripts. Visitors occasionally offered a different perspective. One traveller, approaching Kerikeri after a long journey through the forest, was startled to see what looked like an English village set down among the hills. Neat wooden houses, smoke from chimneys, and cattle wandering home at sunset seemed out of place beside the surrounding pie. His description was not entirely kind. The Maori youths living with the missionaries wore awkward European clothes, their hair cut short beneath woolen caps, and the visitor felt that the natural grace of the people had been hidden beneath borrowed garments. He also complained of a cool reception, finding the settlers reserved and suspicious, rather than eager for conversation. Whether his judgment was fair or not, it revealed the gap between the expectations of outsiders and the cautious habits formed by years of uncertainty. At Paihia, the routine had begun to resemble that of a disciplined community. A bell woke the settlement before dawn, and prayers were held soon after. Part of each day was devoted to studying the language, part to teaching, and part to the endless labour of farming, building, and repairing. The absence of a printing press remained a constant frustration. Many Maori could now read simple sentences, yet there were few pages to place in their hands. The missionaries argued that without printed lessons, the schools would always remain limited, and they appealed repeatedly for someone trained in the craft of printing to be sent from abroad. Kawakawa, another small outpost, illustrated the practical difficulties of agriculture. The soil was promising, but clearing the land required more labour than could be hired. Natives were reluctant to work for long periods, and many were unwilling to sell additional land once they saw its value increasing. Wheat fields planted with hope often looked thin and yellow in the wet seasons, and the dream of feeding the mission from its own harvest remained distant. Early in 1827, a shock arrived from the north. The Wesleyan mission at Whangaroa was suddenly abandoned after conflict among local tribes. The event alarmed the church missionaries, who feared that hostility might spread toward their own settlements. The seizure of the Mercury had already made visiting captains wary, and any further violence could isolate the bay entirely. In response, Samuel Marsden crossed from New South Wales to consult with the settlers and to encourage steadiness. His visit was brief, yet it reassured many that they were not forgotten. At Rangihaua, Kerikeri and Paihia, the schools continued to grow. By mid-year, dozens of boys and girls lived within the mission houses, learning to read and helping with daily tasks. Some former pupils returned to their villages carrying new skills, able to write messages for their families and to interpret the strange ideas of the Europeans. The settlers also began to keep cattle and cultivate larger gardens, attempting to reduce dependence on imported flour. Even so, trade with ships remained essential, and disputes over prices and payments were common. The Herald's career ended abruptly in 1828. While attempting to cross the bar at Hokianga after waiting several days for favourable weather, the wind failed and the schooner was driven onto the rocks. The crew reached shore safely, but the surrounding people stripped the vessel of everything portable, claiming the right according to their custom. Efforts to restrain them nearly cost Mayer his life, saved only by the intervention of a woman who threw her mat over him as a sign of protection. The loss of the Herald was keenly felt, for she had become the mission's lifeline. That same year, the missionaries found themselves drawn into local politics in a way they had never intended. A quarrel between related groups erupted after the theft of slaves and a musket. Retaliation followed, and in the fighting a respected leader named Waremu was killed. His death threatened to plunge the whole region into war. Chiefs from the bay prepared an expedition toward Hokianga, and some asked the missionaries to accompany them and seek peace. 2 of the settlers agreed to go, in carrying no weapons, but hoping that their presence might restrain violence. They walked for days with the war party, sleeping in makeshift camps that resembled bustling fairs. On the Sunday, they hoisted a flag to mark the day of rest and spoke to hundreds of warriors gathered around them. Eventually, both sides met near a deep ditch chosen as neutral ground. After formal dances, volleys of musket fire into the air, and long speeches, the leaders accepted terms of reconciliation. The armies dispersed, and the missionaries returned home exhausted but relieved. For the first time, their influence had reached beyond teaching and farming into the delicate realm of tribal conflict. By the end of 1828, nearly 200 Maori were connected with the various schools. The first annual examination brought them together in the chapel, where they were tested in reading, writing, and arithmetic. The event felt like a festival. After the lessons, a large communal meal was served, and as soon as grace was spoken, the guests gathered up the remaining food to carry home, following their own custom. Girls displayed sewn garments, boys presented carpentry work, and prizes were awarded with great excitement. Such scenes hinted at a society slowly changing form. The following year remained comparatively calm. A few new missionaries arrived from England, while others returned home. Hongi, the formidable warrior who had dominated earlier years, died in March 1828, and many believed his passing marked the end of an era of constant campaigns. Communities around the bay began planting wheat and maize, encouraged by the example of the settlers. Trade in pigs, corn, and potatoes expanded, though muskets and powder still drew the highest prices. Among the local people, figures like Taiwanga stepped forward. He asked that his children be baptized, writing a curious letter in which he spoke of untying the rope that bound him to former ways. His request was granted publicly, and the ceremony made a deep impression. Others soon followed his example, suggesting that the ideas first heard years earlier were taking root at last. As the decade closed, European settlement outside the missions began to grow. Gilbert Mayer established a trading post at Te Wahapu, building warehouses, a wharf, and cottages for craftsmen. Blacksmiths, coopers, and carpenters set up their shops, and visiting whalers found a convenient harbour. Mayer organised networks along the coast to collect produce and even sent the first shipments of Kauri gum overseas after discovering its value for varnish. These developments hinted at a future far larger than the small religious communities imagined at the beginning. In January of 1827, an unexpected drama unfolded in the Bay of Islands. Early one morning, a brig appeared on the horizon, her decks crowded with unfamiliar faces. She was clearly not a whaling vessel, and those watching from shore assumed she must have sailed from Sydney. A boat was lowered and pulled toward the watering place at Kororareka, where barrels were filled as if the crew intended to remain for some time. Suspicion grew quickly. When a messenger crossed to investigate, he returned with troubling news, and soon it became clear that the vessel was the Wellington, supposedly bound for Norfolk Island with convicts and supplies. The prisoners on board had risen in revolt and were now in control, holding the captain, guards, and passengers as hostages. The seizure had been carefully planned long before the ship left port. Walton, a determined and ruthless man, had taken command, appointing fellow convicts to act as officers. The soldiers were trapped below deck, the crew forced into confinement, and the ship turned away from her intended course. The rebels spoke openly of sailing to South America, where they hoped to begin new lives beyond the reach of British law. Yet fear and division haunted them. Some prisoners refused to join the mutiny and were locked with the crew. Others quarrelled over religion and authority, and more than once the fragile alliance threatened to collapse into violence. Reaching New Zealand was not part of their original design, but they lacked charts, fresh water, and nautical instruments. The Bay of Islands offered both supplies and a hiding place. Local whaling captains approached the brig cautiously, puzzled by the strange behaviour of the crew. Questions were answered with evasions, and the presence of armed men dressed in soldiers' jackets only deepened the mystery. Gradually, the truth emerged through whispered messages and nervous glances. The rightful captain managed to reveal his identity, and soon the visitors understood that they were dealing with pirates in all but name. Tension rose over the following days. The rebel leader visited neighbouring ships, attempting to trade stolen provisions and tools, while the settlers debated how to respond. Eventually, the whaling crews resolved to act. Guns were brought on deck, springs set on anchor cables, and plans made to prevent the Wellington from escaping. At dawn, a warning shot was fired, followed by a short bombardment that shattered rigging and terrified the mutineers. Many fled below, others leapt into the sea, and before long negotiations began. The rebels demanded to be allowed ashore with supplies. The rescuers insisted on the release of prisoners and soldiers first. By afternoon, the captives were free and the brig lay once more in loyal hands. The victory did not end the danger. As the convicts were landed, crowds of Maori gathered and stripped them of clothing, a customary act toward defeated enemies. Over the next week, the locals hunted down those who had escaped into the bush, delivering them one by one in exchange for powder and muskets. Each capture was bargained over, and the scene resembled a grim marketplace. Meanwhile, on board the brig, the remaining prisoners plotted a second uprising. Knives were discovered, manacles found nearly sawn through, and several men confessed that they intended to retake the vessel at sea. Extra irons were forged, guards doubled, and the ringleaders chained to the deck. When the ships finally sailed for Sydney, the tension continued. Another conspiracy was uncovered, and severe punishment followed. After arrival, the surviving mutineers were tried, some executed, others condemned to lifelong exile. The episode left a deep mark on both settlers and Maori, demonstrating how quickly the remote harbours of New Zealand could be drawn into the violence of the wider empire. Only 2 years later, another maritime tragedy occurred along the Bay of Plenty. The brig Hawes anchored near Whale Island to prepare pork for trade, using the hot springs there for curing. A local chief guided the ship to safety, yet suspicion lingered. One morning, several crewmen went ashore with him, and when the captain followed to investigate their delay, gunshots echoed from the vessel. Before the boat could return, the brig was seized and 3 sailors killed. Their bodies were mutilated, and the ship plundered by the attackers. Assistance arrived from a nearby schooner, and after a tense confrontation, the Hawes was retaken, though badly damaged and stripped of many supplies. The second mate, held captive on shore, was ransomed with weapons and powder, revealing how commerce and violence had become dangerously entangled. Alongside these dramatic events existed another, quieter trade that disturbed visitors even more than piracy. The people of New Zealand possessed an ancient custom of preserving human heads. Originally, the practice honoured friends and respected enemies, keeping their likenesses as memorials or trophies. The process was elaborate. The brain removed, the skull cleansed, the skin treated with heat and smoke, and the features carefully shaped with fibre so that the tattooed patterns remained visible. When prepared in this way, the head could endure for many years, a silent witness to battles and alliances. European curiosity transformed this ritual into a commodity. Sailors and collectors began to purchase the relics, and prices in Sydney reached astonishing levels. Demand encouraged grim innovation. Chiefs tattooed slaves, solely to make their heads more valuable, and strangers were murdered for the sake of their markings. Stories circulated of traders bargaining for the head of a living man, promising to return for the finished article. The moral boundaries that had once limited the custom were steadily eroded by profit. Tensions flared whenever these objects were displayed before the relatives of the dead. On one notorious occasion, a ship's master emptied a sack of newly bought heads onto his deck in the Bay of Islands. Cries of recognition rose from the crowd, and only a swift departure saved him from vengeance. Such incidents convinced the colonial authorities that the trade was poisoning relations between cultures. A proclamation was issued, forbidding the import of preserved heads, and condemning the traffic as an incentive to murder. Owners were urged to surrender any specimens so they might be returned to their families. The ban gradually reduced the commerce, yet the memory of it lingered. Observers compared the Maori custom with practices from other parts of the world: scalps in America, skulls in New Guinea, trophies among ancient warriors. But none carried quite the same blend of artistry, grief, and exploitation. What had begun as a form of remembrance became a symbol of the collision between two societies, each struggling to understand the other while navigating the turbulent currents of trade, faith, and survival. Late in the summer of 1830, a small quarrel on the shore of Kororareka ignited one of the most destructive conflicts the Bay of Islands had yet seen. Two young women of high rank, daughters of influential chiefs from Kerikeri and Kawakawa, went to bathe together at the beach. Both were closely connected to Captain Brind, master of the British whaling ship Toward Castle, then anchored among several foreign vessels in the bay. For years the captain had favoured the Kawakawa girl and showered her family with gifts, but recently he had taken the daughter of Rewa as a second companion. The rivalry between the women sharpened, and harsh words were exchanged. One cursed the other, and the insult was understood to include her entire tribe. Among the Maori, cursing was not a casual matter. It was considered a deeply dangerous act, very different from European swearing. The language of abuse usually referred to cannibal imagery, reducing the victim to something fit only to be cooked and eaten. Such words struck at personal and tribal dignity. Slaves who cursed their masters were often killed immediately, and even between free people, a curse demanded payment or blood. When the story of the women's quarrel spread, the various sub-tribes quickly took sides, drawing allies into the dispute as if an old feud had suddenly reawakened. Pomare and his followers supported the Kawakawa family and prepared to defend Kororareka. Rewa gathered his relatives and planned an attack against those sheltering his rival. At first it was hoped that the plundering of nearby Kumara gardens would satisfy the need for compensation. But the anger ran too deep. On the 6th of March, the beach erupted in gunfire. Warriors arrived from Whangaroa under the leadership of Ururoa, determined to settle the matter by force. Missionaries who lived nearby crossed the water to plead for restraint. They found the attackers eating the sweet potatoes they had just seized from the gardens, sitting in council and boasting of their strength. The visitors were received politely and were even invited to speak. For a moment, it seemed possible that reason might prevail. Yet the next morning, heavy firing echoed across the bay. Through telescopes, people could be seen running in every direction, canoes pulling desperately toward the anchored ships, carrying women and children to safety. One of the missionaries landed directly at the scene of the fighting. The two parties were crouched only a few yards apart behind fences and screens. He shouted for them to stop, but the noise of muskets drowned his voice. When he reached the chief Tohetapu and begged him to intervene, the old man refused to move. Soon afterward, Rewa stepped forward and waved for silence. By then, many lay dead or wounded. The beach became a field hospital, and sailors from the nearby vessels helped carry the injured aboard. The deck of the Royal Sovereign, anchored close to the shore, filled with torn bodies and weeping relatives. The ship's surgeon worked without pause, while terrified families crowded together seeking protection. After a brief collapse, the attacking force was allowed to return and gather their fallen chiefs, though the bodies of lesser men were left behind. One Kororareka leader, seeing a corpse of minor rank, split it open with a hatchet and removed a portion of the liver as an offering to the gods. The mixture of grief and ritual stunned the Europeans who witnessed it. Observers were struck by how quickly enemies mingled once the shooting stopped. Parents discovered that their own children had fought on the opposite side. Brothers had aimed muskets at brothers. The war was not a clash of distant peoples, but a tearing apart of one community. At dawn on Sunday, scattered shots were heard again, yet by morning the Whangaroa warriors withdrew to the island of Moturoa. Refugees streamed to the mission settlement at Paihia, carrying everything they could salvage. In the afternoon, the houses of Kororareka were seen burning, and the beach emptied as the inhabitants fled upriver to fortified positions. The numbers involved were uncertain. Some spoke of hundreds on each side. but the devastation was undeniable. Reinforcements were summoned from every direction, and a wider conflict seemed inevitable. At this critical moment, a ship arrived carrying Samuel Marsden, whose presence carried great influence among many chiefs. Meetings were arranged between the opposing parties. After long debate, it was agreed that Kururareka would be handed over as compensation for the chief Hongi, who had been killed at the very start of the battle, and for all the others who had fallen. The word peace was spoken repeatedly, yet distrust remained. Over the following days, delegations crossed back and forth between the camps according to custom. Speeches were delivered in the traditional style, speakers pacing before seated audiences, while arguments were weighed. War dances were performed not as threats, but as formal expressions of unity. Eventually, a symbolic ceremony sealed the agreement. A chief recited a long chant, broke a small stick, and cast it at the feet of his counterpart, who repeated the act in return. The breaking of the sticks signified that hostilities were ended. To outsiders, it appeared that the crisis had passed, but beneath the surface, the desire for revenge still burned. Hongi's sons, Mango and Kakaha, had not accepted the settlement. Among the Māori, payment for a death could be taken from almost any group, not only from those directly responsible. If one path was closed, another would be found. Some years earlier, a similar logic had nearly stripped a mission station of all its possessions because a single carpenter had insulted a chief. Justice was collective, and property, not individuals, often bore the penalty. The brothers organised a war party of about 70 relatives and set out to seek compensation elsewhere. They first landed at Mercury Island, surprising a small community and killing many. Only one man escaped, surviving a terrible head wound and living on roots and shellfish until rescued. The raiders then moved to Mare Island, where further massacres followed. Encouraged by their success, they debated whether to return home or continue. Their leader insisted that the spirits demanded more blood and urged them on to Motiti Island. Meanwhile, the powerful Ngaitarangi tribe of Tauranga had learned of the killings. A fleet of canoes carrying nearly 1,000 warriors sailed to intercept the invaders. Reaching Motiti at midday, they saw the enemy's canoes drawn up on the beach. The attackers were allowed a brief rest before battle, then split their forces to surround the island and cut off escape. The Ngapuhi raiders mistook the approaching canoes for friendly reinforcements and rushed to greet them. The mistake proved fatal. Outnumbered and scattered, they were overwhelmed, almost without resistance. The aged leader, Haramiti, blind and sitting in the stern of his canoe, was beaten to death with fists, his blood considered too sacred to spill with weapons. Only 2 men survived. One spared, and later returned through missionary efforts, another who swam to the mainland. The heads of the slain were preserved according to custom and later sold to a foreign trader. When the captain displayed them on his deck before the grieving relatives, the outrage nearly cost him his ship. The episode shocked colonial authorities, and strict measures were introduced to end the trade in such relics. News of the disaster reached the Bay of Islands months later and plunged the region into renewed unrest. Although the fallen warriors had embarked on a mission of slaughter, their families still demanded compensation. Councils were held, and for a time it seemed the entire North might march south in revenge. Only the season of planting delayed the storm. These events revealed the fragile balance of the period. European ships brought wealth and new weapons, yet they also entangled themselves in local rivalries. Missionaries attempted to preach restraint, but ancient codes of honour continued to guide decisions. A quarrel between 2 young women over the favour of a foreign captain had grown into a conflict that reshaped alliances across the islands, demonstrating how deeply personal insults could echo through an entire society. When the northern tribes completed the preparations for their new campaign, a fierce confidence spread through their camps. Warriors spoke openly of sweeping through the Bay of Plenty, convinced that victory was certain and that the southern people would fall before them, as others had in earlier years. Yet alongside this rising tide of aggression moved another current. The missionaries, who had lived among the tribes long enough to understand both their courage and their cruelty, resolved once more to intervene. They hoped to turn the expedition away from slaughter and toward reconciliation, even if it meant accompanying the warriors into the heart of the conflict. Late in November, a small party of clergy travelled to Kororareka to learn whether any desire for peace remained among Ngapuhi. The chiefs were busy hauling canoes to the water and fitting them for the long voyage south. Tools were dropped as the visitors approached, and a circle formed around them. At first the response was harsh. Rewa rose and declared with passionate gestures that the purpose of the expedition was to fight, to seize slaves, and to humble Tauranga. He warned that any Europeans who followed would witness scenes they might not endure. Yet when the anger cooled, he admitted in private that the decision was not his alone, and that the missionaries were free to travel with the fleet if they wished. Rumours complicated matters. Some feared that while the warriors were away, rival groups might descend upon Kororareka and attack the families left behind. The clergy were asked to visit those communities and seek assurances of safety. Within a week, the atmosphere had softened enough for several members of the mission to receive formal permission to accompany the expedition. Though talk of extermination still echoed through the villages, a minority of leaders clearly hoped that the presence of neutral witnesses might restrain the worst impulses of war. Early in December, sails appeared on the horizon as canoes gathered from every inlet. The missionaries crossed to Kororareka at the invitation of Tohitapu, who urged them to be bold and not to be discouraged by hostile words. Meetings were held at the house of Moka and later with Ururoa, the formidable Wangaroa chief. He showed little enthusiasm for fighting and seemed ready to follow whichever path the majority chose. Titore, however, remained determined. He admitted that when the fleet reached Tauranga, an opportunity for peace might arise, but the voyage itself would go ahead. By mid-December, the tone of the warriors had changed again. Chiefs who had once shouted for vengeance now asked that both mission vessels accompany the canoes, a sign that the appeal for moderation was beginning to take root. The expedition finally sailed in the first days of January 1832. Nearly 600 men crowded into scores of canoes, while the mission boats moved among them like quiet guardians. Progress was slow. The fleet crept along the coast, pausing at sheltered bays to rest and prepare food. Much of the leisure was spent making cartridges or carving spare paddles, while others simply slept, conserving strength. The customs of war imposed heavy restrictions. No cooked food was allowed in the sacred canoes. Fires were forbidden, and even a few drops of water shipped over the side caused alarm. When this occurred, the men fell silent and murmured incantations to avert ill fortune. During the second week, an incident revealed the unpredictable dangers of the journey. A canoe arrived shouting that 4 Europeans had been captured at sea. The prisoners, sailors from a trading vessel, had been stripped of their belongings and were destined to be used as labour to haul the great guns. After firm persuasion from the missionaries, the chiefs agreed to release them, and the frightened men were allowed to continue their voyage. Tariha, one of the principal leaders, travelled apart from the others in a large tapu canoe accompanied only by 3 wives. Within it lay the preserved body of Hongi, whose death had set the whole conflict in motion. The canoe was to be carried to the place where Hongi's sons had fallen, then broken up and burned as an offering to the spirits. many wondered whether Tariha would abandon the fleet and return home. For a chief could change his mind without consulting anyone. As the expedition moved southward, food grew scarce and tempers frayed. On a Sunday, the warriors were ordered to abstain from work, yet hunger made the restriction bitter. Some Hokianga men proposed leaving the main force and attacking Tauranga by another route, hoping to strike the women and children before the missionaries could prevent it. The clergy struggled to keep the fragile unity intact. At Wangamatta, an extraordinary ceremony was witnessed. Before any eating or drinking could occur, the priest prepared an oracle on a secluded patch of ground. Sticks were planted in rows to represent the canoes and the enemy chiefs. After the leaders withdrew, the old seer remained alone to consult the spirits. When the warriors returned, they found many sticks thrown down, signs of those destined to die. The scene filled the men with awe, yet soon afterward a bell rang for Christian worship and more than 100 attended, a striking blend of ancient ritual and new faith. Tauranga was reached on the 6th of March. The canoes formed a vast line across the water, each flying a different flag obtained from passing ships. The camp was established at Matakana, and almost at once news arrived that advance parties had already skirmished with the defenders. Before dawn one night, a burst of gunfire echoed across the river, and messengers appeared reporting that no blood had yet been shed. At daybreak, the warriors crossed toward the pa of Otumoetai. The land behind them was set alight so that flames lit the sky and reflected upon the water, giving the flotilla the appearance of a moving town. For several hours muskets cracked from both sides, yet the exchange was strangely ineffective. The attackers soon returned to camp with only one man killed, and another saved by the cartridge box strapped to his waist. Days passed in this uneasy stalemate. Scouts crept close to the palisades, dancing in defiance while shots flew overhead. A trader arrived offering guns and powder on credit, hoping to profit from the struggle. His presence troubled the missionaries, who saw how easily the conflict could be prolonged by such bargains. Convinced that little more could be achieved, one of the clergy withdrew to the mission schooner. From its deck, the skirmishes appeared almost theatrical. Children in the pio calmly digging up bullets that fell among them. The chiefs, once so confident, now seemed weary and uncertain. Their great guns had failed, and reinforcements from Waikato had strengthened the enemy. Yet the war was not finished. In mid-March, a new outbreak occurred when a Makatu warrior was killed. Women wailed over the corpse, cutting themselves and smearing their faces with blood, while the men muttered of renewed vengeance. The father of the dead man pleaded for peace, but his voice was soon drowned by others, calling for action. The missionaries made one more attempt. Sailing to Tauranga, they found Titore and his northern allies preparing for another assault. The leaders listened respectfully and even asked the clergy to carry messages to Otumoetai. The defenders responded that they were ready either to fight or to talk. But while negotiations dragged on, the Rarawa unexpectedly attacked the PA without warning, proving that the thirst for battle still burned. After weeks of fruitless effort, the visitors acknowledged defeat. They had followed the warriors at great risk, yet the ancient code of Utu proved stronger than every appeal. Returning north, they learned that the campaign had brought little glory. The chiefs admitted that their expedition had failed, and some even said that the missionaries' God had confused their aim. Peace was finally declared in the winter of 1832, though it was fragile from the beginning. The heads of the slain were displayed with grim ceremony at Kororareka, and the scenes that accompanied them revealed how deeply the old ways still ruled. Titore himself lingered in the south and soon gathered another force, this time joined by Rarawa men who had no direct part in the original quarrel. The clergy again felt compelled to follow, hoping that their presence might restrain the worst excesses. They travelled to Makatu in the early months of 1833 and found the camps restless and divided. Skirmishes continued, and reports of killings spread fear through the countryside. Although some chiefs spoke of reconciliation, others remained eager for a final reckoning. By June of that year, a formal peace was proclaimed, encouraged by traders who wished for stable relations. Yet even this settlement could not erase the memory of blood. Only days later, a group of Rarawa left behind at Tauranga were surprised and killed, and the cycle threatened to begin anew. Thus, a quarrel that had started between two young women over the favour of a foreign captain had drawn entire regions into years of violence. The missionaries who sailed with the warriors acted as uneasy witnesses, trying to bend ancient customs toward mercy. Their efforts did not end the fighting, but they revealed how a society standing between tradition and change struggled to choose its future.